Section 80 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Veronica Mead. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. An Authentic Record of Remarkable Cases. By John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. Problematic Cases, Part 2. Walton, Dwight. Part 2. In the last will and testament of Colonel Dwight, he is frank enough to state that his only assets were the monies to be derived from the life insurance companies, and that he did not consider himself morally or otherwise required to pay anything to his creditors, from whom he escaped through his bankruptcy proceedings. At the same time, as has heretofore been noted, he bequeathed large sums for a purpose the artifice and significance of which would seem to have been as transparent at the time as it is today. Nor is it any easier at this late day than it was then to reconcile such a conflicting attitude with the ethics and equities which govern the relations and the transactions of honorable men. With a similar flourish, and an eye to stage effect, the Grand Seigneur directed a number of trifling sums, from $1.60 upwards, to be paid to certain small creditors who were specifically named. This eagerness to pay his petty personal debts seemed to indicate that he expected to die soon. After the payment of the legacies, the will provided that the bulk of the money, to be derived from the insurance companies, should pass to his wife and son. But, if the wife should not be released from bankruptcy, her share was to go to the son, in order to prevent it being used for the payment of debts. His frame of mind is reflected in the following statement in the will. I have lived to that age, and been subject to such experience, that I have no further ambition for myself beyond leaving my family comfortable, and with sufficient means to enable them to live as they were in the habit of living heretofore. And also in making such friendly bequests to those who are endeared to me from association and kindly acts, as will leave pleasant memories behind me when I start on the long journey. From a carefully written discussion of the medico-legal aspects of the case by Dr. Horatio C. Wood of Philadelphia, the following interesting passages are extracted. 58 hours after death, the first autopsy was made on the alleged body of Colonel Dwight. The results obtained were testified to on the part of the defense by Dr. John Swinburne, and are embodied in the first hypothetical question herein presented. A second autopsy was made about 5 months after death in the presence of various physicians. The results obtained were testified to by Drs. Swinburne, Sherman, and Bridges, and are also embodied, as far as they are of any importance, in the hypothetical question. Before taking up these questions, it seems proper to give a little more in detail the evidence submitted by the defense in regard to 2 or 3 points. As to the condition of the heart, Dr. Swinburne testified that the heart was perfectly healthy in every particular, except that some little thickening was noticed around the edges of the valves, and that at the second autopsy he carefully examined the coronary artery and found it entirely normal. Dr. Sherman testified that, at the second autopsy, he found the heart remarkably firm and in a good state of preservation, that he had prepared about 150 slides of its walls for microscopical examination, and found in each the muscular fiber perfectly normal. He had with him in court a number of these specimens, and offered them for examination by any experts who might be called by the plaintiff, but no such examination was made. Dr. Austin Flint, Jr. stated that he had examined a number of these slides and found the heart tissues normal. Dr. H. C. Wood confirmed this condition of the muscle fiber in the slides which he had examined. Dr. E. H. Bridges testified that he had examined the heart both macroscopically and microscopically and found it normal. When it was borne in the mind that Colonel Dwight was an athletic man in the prime of his life, 41 years of age, had spent the last months of his life hunting in a hilly country without suffering from shortness of breath or other distress, that the lesions in the body were entirely diverse from those found after death from heart failure, that the heart had emptied itself of blood and ceased its action in systole, that there was no evidence whatsoever at the trial in any way contradicting the statements made by Dr. Swinburne, Sherman, and Bridges, that the heart, carefully examined macroscopically, appeared to be perfectly normal, and the assertions of Drs. Sherman, Bridges, A. Flint, Jr., and H. C. Wood, that the fibers were shown by microscopical examination to have their striae well marked and to be entirely free from degeneration, the question as to the condition of the heart must be considered as settled. Certainly no opinion that death resulted from heart failure could be given upon the evidence furnished at the trial. In regard to the existence of superficial emphysema of the lung, as presented at the first autopsy, Dr. Swinburne testified minutely and positively. Although from some oversight, this testimony was not embodied in the hypothetical question as to the cause of death as given a little later. Such recent, fresh rupture of the upper air vesicles is, in itself, almost sufficient to prove that a man has died from an obstruction to respiration in the throat. To rupture the air vesicles, there must be a great internal pressure, as of forced respiration, and prevention of the escape of the air, which then tears open those vesicles whose walls are not closely supported by other vesicles, or by tightly contracting muscles. In regard to the alleged furrow in the neck, Dr. Swinburne testified that it was a heavy indentation in the neck, commencing on the right side near the hyoid bone, and extending upwards and backwards to within, perhaps, an inch or so, and perhaps less, of the center of the posterior part of the neck. On the left side, the same indentation commenced about the upper part of the cricoid cartilage, extended about the same angle upwards and backwards until the indentations came within an inch and a half of meeting. These indentations were full 3/8 of an inch deep, so you could lay your finger right in them, and about that in width. I should say full that. At the bottom of the indentation there was a peculiar appearance, sort of leathery appearance, or had a half-burnt or scorched appearance. Dr. Swinburne further stated that at the second autopsy this indentation was plainly perceptible, and the same peculiar condition which appeared before at the bottom of the indentation was present, that sort of leathery or hardened feeling. Dr. Sherman testified that, at the second autopsy, he called attention to the deep furrow in the neck, and put his finger in it. He stated that the texture of the skin within this furrow had a leathery feeling. It was what Casper calls mummified. That he had seen other cases where death had been the cause by strangulation with a cord, and that the furrow had had the same characters as in the other cases. Dr. Bridges testified that the furrow was rounded at the bottom about 1/8 to about 1/4 of an inch thick, and 1/4 to 1/2 an inch broad. The lower or bottom part of the furrow or groove was rounded, so that it fitted the convex surface of my little finger that I passed through on each side. The base of the groove was hard, and had this appearance that had been described, a parchment look. Mr. Nat B. Freeman testified that he had, during the war, been accustomed to handling corpses, and familiarizing himself with their external appearances, that at the second autopsy he examined the furrow, found that it was deep enough for my finger to go partially in it, that the skin at the bottom of the furrow appeared hard. The feeling was a hard feeling. Its appearance was similar in appearance to old leather. In regard to the cause of death, Dr. Swinburne gave us his firmly settled opinion, based upon personal knowledge of the external and internal appearances of the body, that the death had been caused by strangulation with a rope or cord. The position of the other experts was judicial, so far as concerned the cause of death. They gave their opinions upon hypothetical questions which embodied the evidence as to facts which had been given and bore upon the subject. There were several hypothetical questions given, but for want of space, only the one which bore directly upon the main issue as to the cause of death is here inserted. You examine about 58 hours after death, in the middle of November, the body of a man found dead at about 11 p.m., having been last seen alive 1 hour and a half before, and then apparently not in a condition of apprehension of sudden death. You find it to be the body of an unusually large and powerful man. Great muscular vigor, with a considerable development of firm fat. 41 years of age, you find nothing unusual in the appearance of the face and the general surface of the skin, except the presence of small dark spots indicating a little effusion of blood in the skin of the back and the back of the right arm. A furrow about the sides of the neck nearly meeting in front and back, about the size of the little finger. Rounded at the bottom, and the skin involved in the furrow dense and hard, and a surface like parchment. The furrow beginning in front, just above the larynx, and extending upwards and backwards at an angle of nearly 45 degrees. The brain and membranes, perfectly natural and healthy, except a clot of blood on the surface on one side near the top of the head, the clot being evidently of very recent origin, but not sufficient in itself to produce death. The lungs deeply congested with dark liquid blood, but presenting no evidence of inflammation. A few small fibrous nodules, and the bronchial tubes and windpipe deeply congested and filled with bloody mucus. The heart and the blood vessels, including the valves of the heart, and the vessels supplying the blood to the substance of the heart, absolutely healthy and natural in size, and in every other regard, excepting a slight unimportant thickening of some of the valves. The cavities of the heart containing a very small quantity of dark blood. the liver, spleen, and kidneys absolutely natural and healthy, except that they, especially the kidneys, are deeply congested with blood, and of natural size and weight, a small quantity of undigested food in the stomach. The mucous membrane of the stomach and intestines congested, and a small area of apparent inflammation about the size of $1 in the stomach. Finding all the organs in the conditions stated, and the furrow made as described above, what, in your opinion, was the immediate cause of death? To this, Dr. Wood answered, the death could only have been produced by strangulation with a cord. After the cross-examination of Dr. Wood, experts were called, one after the other, until the court refused to hear any more. In this way, Doctors Porter, Sherman, Bridges, Avery, Lee, and Hand, the latter three gentlemen being practicing physicians and coroners, or ex-coroners, of Chenango County, New York, were allowed to answer the hypothetical question, and all agreed with the answer given by Dr. Wood. The only evidence offered by the plaintiff bearing upon the medico-legal facts in the case was, first, in regard to the 2 alleged chills occurring during his illness, the last one a week previous to his death. The only evidence given concerning these attacks was that of Mrs. Bessie MacDonald and Mr. Francis Down. It was so indefinite, and would require so much space for its recital here, that the reader is referred to the Book of Corrected Evidence. From it is impossible to state, with any degree of positiveness, what the nature of the attacks was. It is not probable that they were malaria, for in the first attack there was no fever, and in the second attack the fever lasted for perhaps half an hour, and the chief symptom was abdominal pain. The counsel for the plaintiffs offered to prove the symptoms and nature of the sickness of Colonel Dwight and the cause of his death by Doctors Orton and Burr, who attended Colonel Dwight in his last illness, and were each of them on the witness stand. According to the law of the state of New York, no physician is allowed to testify concerning a patient, or to give information which has been imparted to him by a patient, unless the latter publicly gives his consent. And when the defense, in an early stage of the trial, sought to put Dr. Doane on the stand to prove that Colonel Dwight's hemorrhage came from the lungs, they were debarred under the statute. The counsel for the plaintiffs contended that the right of waiver passes to the executors of a dead man, but on the part of the defendant, such interpretation of the law was strenuously resisted. Many hours were spent in legal argument, but the court finally decided in favor of the plaintiffs and permitted Doctors Orton and Burr to testify as to their knowledge of the sickness of Colonel Dwight and the causes of his death. When, however, this right was granted, the counsel for the plaintiffs did not exercise it, and neither Dr. Orton nor Dr. Burr was asked a single question concerning the symptoms of Colonel Dwight's alleged last illness or the causes of his death. Under these circumstances, it seems impossible for a professional man to attach importance to the statements made by persons without medical knowledge concerning the symptoms of the alleged illness. There are no important data other than those furnished in the evidence for the defense by Dr. Porter, even for deciding whether the sickness was real or feigned. There is certainly no proof that the alleged chills were not produced by overdoses of a depressing vegetable poison, and the gastric symptoms by overdoses of arsenic, both of which drugs were in Colonel Dwight's possession and under his personal control. End of section 80. Section 81 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Veronica Mead. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. An authentic record of remarkable cases by John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. Problematic Cases, Part 3. Walton Dwight, Part 3. Second, in regard to the occurrence of the night of Colonel Dwight's death, the only important testimony was that of Mr. Charles A. Hull. According to Mrs. Owen, Mr. W. F. Spaulding and Mrs. Dwight were already in the room of Colonel Dwight when she, Mrs. Owens, entered directly after his death. It is altogether probable that Mr. W. F. Spaulding had intimate acquaintance with the circumstances surrounding the death of Colonel Dwight. The defense could not call him, since, according to their theory of the case, he had guilty knowledge, and if he should testify falsely, they, not being able to cross-examine or contradict their own witness, would be held by his declarations. The failure of the plaintiffs to put either Mr. Spaulding or Mrs. Dwight on the stand naturally excited comment. Mr. Charles A. Hull testified that he had never sat up with Colonel Dwight until the night of his death, that he had been his assignee in bankruptcy, but not intimately acquainted with him, that he had no knowledge or experience in nursing, that no medicines were left with him, and no instructions given him by the physicians on Friday evening, and that Mr. Dwight sent for him the Wednesday preceding the Friday of his, Dwight's, death, and had requested him at the interview to sit up with him on Friday night because, in an emergency, he thought I was cool and would not get excited. He also admitted on cross-examination that he had stated before the coroner's jury that Dwight said he wanted him because he would be cool in case anything should happen. Mr. Hall testified that shortly after 10 o'clock, I stationed myself in a chair near the door leading into his bedroom, and this door was partially open, and I sat there. During the time I sat there, at one time the colonel called me, and said his head was feverish, and wished me to saturate a cloth in bay rum and put it on his head, and I did so. And at another time he called for some water, and I gave him a swallow of water. After that he seemed to sleep, and before, at different times, I thought he was sleeping, but of course it was uncertain, and I did not disturb him. Along about between 11 o'clock and 11:30, I heard him gasp for breath, as it seemed to me, and he says, "Charlie," and called to me, and I went to his side as quick as I could, and put my hand under his head, and raised his head up, and gave him some brandy. And then I ran across the hall as rapidly as I could to Mrs. Dwight's door, and rapped on it very loud, and went back to the bedside again, and I think I administered brandy a second time then, and I felt of his pulse, and in a short time Mrs. Dwight came out, only partially dressed, and I asked her to touch the bell for Mr. Spaulding, and she did so. In a very short time Mr. Spaulding came up there, and was followed by Mrs. Owens, Mr. Spaulding's brother, and his family, consisting of his wife and daughter. That about 15 minutes before he heard the gasping, Colonel Dwight took a biscuit from a stand near the bed and ate it. Also that he, Hall, sat in a chair, so placed in the sitting room that he could see all of Colonel Dwight's movements through the open door. He further stated that Mr. Spaulding pinched Dwight's tongue, leading to the suspicion that it was protruding. The only other evidence at all bearing upon the events now under discussion was that given by James E. Lee, the servant who brought the hot water in which Mrs. Owens and Mr. Hall testified. The hands of Colonel Dwight were soaked after she entered the room. Mr. Lee believed that he saw Colonel Dwight breathing at the rate of about 4 or 5 times a minute. Before this, however, according to the statements of both Hull and Mrs. Owens, Colonel Dwight was dead. Third, as already stated, the expert testimony on the part of the plaintiffs was limited to a description of the lesions found in the body after death. In regard to these lesions, the cross-examination of Doctors Hyde, Burr, Chichilla, and Orton elicited the fact there was very little non-agreement between them and Dr. Swinburne, except in regard to the appearances upon the neck. It was claimed by several, if not all of these gentlemen, that the so-called indentation upon the neck was simply a crease or fold in the skin. But on cross-examination they all admitted that they had signed at the time of the autopsy, when the body was before them, without comment or protest, an official description of this crease as a heavy indentation extending upwards and backwards from os hyoids to right around back of neck, and on left side, below the thyroid cartilage, running upwards and backwards at the angle of about 45 degrees. In the manuscript notes of the autopsy, there were certain erasures and interlineations. The testimony as to whether these had been made before or after signing was conflicting, but on other points there was no question as to the authenticity of the notes which bore testimony to the existence of several small ecchymoses of skin of back and shoulders, anterior part of right arm, small ecchymosis. In other respects, the description corresponded with that given by Dr. Swinburne in the testimony for the defense, except that the word bloody had been scratched over with a pen, as it occurred in the notes before mucus, speaking in reference to the bronchial tubes, and that, instead of the lungs being said to be emphysematous, they were spoken of as unduly inflated. Testimony was given by Mr. Van Vradenburg, Mr. Aris, the undertaker, and James E. Lee, in regard to the existence of a furrow around the neck shortly after death. Mr. Van Vradenburg testified that his examination of his neck was close and marked, and that he was led to make this examination on account of something that was then stirring in his own mind. The nature of this something was not in evidence, but Mr. Van Vradenburg further stated that it did not lead him to investigate any other part of Dwight's person, nor did he examine the feet or hands. Mr. Ayres testified that he was the undertaker who prepared Colonel Dwight's body. washing and dressing him, that directly after his death there was no crease or mark as of a rope or otherwise upon his neck. He further testified that the body was placed in an icebox in such a way that the head was forcibly bent forward on the body, the chin resting upon the chest, and the occiput being raised. He gave it as his opinion that the crease or furrow or indentation subsequently found in the neck of Colonel Dwight was produced by the elevation of the head in the icebox, and its subsequent restoration to the normal position. Mr. James E. Lee stated that he assisted the undertaker, and the crease was not there then. After the plaintiffs had closed the case, the defense recalled their experts and put to them the following hypothetical questions. There was no dispute whatever as to the agreement of the conditions of these questions with the facts of the case as testified to by the medical witnesses for the plaintiffs. In the second question, the testimony of Messrs. Van Vradenburg, Ayres, and Lee in regard to the non-existence of the furrow directly after death was omitted. The medical part of the question is taken almost verbatim from the notes of the autopsy, the disputed part of these notes being omitted. Question 1. Assuming that a man of 41 years of age, who had previously enjoyed robust health, had been complaining for about 3 weeks, and was found on a Saturday morning in bed, shivering, teeth chattering, surface clammy and cold, with the blood settled under his nails, and so continued from 1 to 2 hours, breaking out into a cold sweat, with a feeble, whispering voice, and that this attack passed off without fever, that the second Friday after this occurrence, having during the day been up attending to business with his lawyer, and having his beard dressed by a barber, he had left about 10 p.m. by his doctor in such a condition as to create no alarm, that at or about 11 p.m. he spoke pleasantly to his attendant, calling his attention to his manner of eating a biscuit, helping himself to one from a dish near his bed, and chewing it without difficulty. That within 15 minutes the attention of the attendant was called to such man by a gasping voice, and that this man was dead in a few minutes thereafter. That at an autopsy held within 58 hours after death, the liver and the spleen were found to be normal, except congested, the heart nearly empty, and that there was no pigmentation anywhere. Could or could not such a man have died of congestive chill or any other form of malaria fever? The uniform answer to this question by the experts was that, in their opinion, he could not have so died. Question 2. Suppose that a man, after an obscure alleged illness of about 5 weeks' duration, is on a given day able to be up and transact business with his lawyer and have his beard trimmed, is left by his doctor at 10 p.m. on the same day in such a condition as not to give any cause for alarm, and that at 11 p.m. is talking pleasantly to his attendant and eating a biscuit, and in less than half an hour after is dead, and that at the autopsy, made 58 hours after death, the following conditions are revealed. A heavy indentation, extending upwards and backwards from os hyoids to right around back of neck, and on left side below the thyroid cartilage, running upwards and backwards at an angle of about 45 degrees. Postmortem discoloration of posterior portion of body. Several small ecchymoses of skin of back and shoulders. Anterior part of right arm, small ecchymosis. Thorax, lungs, and heart in natural position, except that the lungs are unduly inflated. About 4 ounces of serum in bottom of left pleural cavity. The same amount in right pleural cavity. Left lung 1 pound and 3/4. Bronchi congested and covered with mucus. Upper lobe congested and edematous. Lower lobe still more congested and edematous. Right lung 2 pounds. Bronchi congested and coated with mucus. Upper lobe at the apex several small fibrous nodules. Rest of upper lobe congested and edematous. Lower lobe congested and edematous. Heart healthy. Weight 15 ounces. Right ventricle contains a little fluid blood, not over 1/2 ounce. Left ventricle contains little fluid blood, not over 1/2 ounce. Left auricle contains a little clotted blood. Stomach, at the fundus mucous membrane, softened and partly destroyed by postmortem changes. Pyloric end of stomach, mucous membrane studded with small white spots denoting chronic gastritis. Liver congested more than usual. Normal color and consistence. Kidneys uniformly congested and otherwise healthy. Epiglottis, larynx, and trachea congested and coated with mucus. Inner surface of the dura mater on the left side, chronic hemorrhagic pachymeningitis with a small extravasation of blood on the left side, over the posterior portion of the parietal and anterior portion of the occipital lobes. Pia mater of convexity normal, except discoloration over occipital lobes from blood. Brain neither congested nor anemic, otherwise healthy. And further, that at an inquest held 5 months after the first autopsy, the indentation on the neck was still distinctly visible. Could or not death have been produced by natural causes? The answer to this question was given by Doctors Porter, Swinburne, Bridges, Sherman, and Wood, who agreed in stating that it could not. To each of these physicians the further question was put as to what in their opinion was the cause of death under the conditions named. All agreed in answering positively that death was produced by strangulation with a rope or cord. The following question was asked in regard to the furrow. Question 3. Assuming that the body of a man, weighing in the neighborhood of 200 pounds, 41 years of age, having a full fleshy neck, about 2 hours after death is placed upon a board on its back, with the head raised upon a book and 2 pillows, and left in that position for about 9 hours, and then placed in an ice box with its head elevated at an angle of about 45 degrees, and left there for almost 48 hours, and then removed and placed flat on a table. Is it possible that a heavy indentation, commencing near the Adam's apple and running upward and backward at an angle of about 45 degrees on either side to within less than 2 inches of meeting in the rear, could be produced by the changes in position stated? The negative answer which was given by the experts to whom the question was put seems entirely correct. It is difficult to conceive how a fold or crease, made by bending the neck, should deserve the use of the term heavy indentation to describe it. And it is still more inconceivable that a fold or crease should be made in the back of the neck by bending the head forwards, which would necessarily stretch the parts said to be folded. Further, a crease made in the manner described would be most marked in the front of the neck, where the center of the fold would occur, whereas the indentation was not visible at this place. Moreover, the plaintiff's experts stated that the indentation involved the subdermal adipose tissue of the sides of the neck, and it is very hard to understand how a crease made by bending the neck forward for a day or two could do this, and be so deeply impressed as to remain distinctly perceptible after the body had been buried 5 or 6 months. In concluding the statement of the case of Colonel Dwight, it remains only to call attention finally to the remarkable agreement that there is in the testimony, and to the fact that there was extremely little conflict, practically no conflict at all between the experts, that the sole contradiction of any importance was between Messrs. Van Vradenburg, Aris, and Lee on the one hand, and the experts on the other. If the former witnesses were correct in affirming that there was no indentation in the neck directly after death, the theory of strangulation with a cord drops. Although it would still be proved by the internal appearances that death was caused by mechanical asphyxia, produced in some other way than by a cord, it must be remembered that it is a well-known fact that in suicidal hanging, in which the suspension has been only for a few minutes, the cord mark acquires its color only some hours after death, and then becomes more prominent. That Colonel Dwight was a heavily bearded man, and that his beard might have hid the fresh indentation from an unsuspecting undertaker. If, finally, it is considered that there is an absolute conflict of testimony, Dr. Wood leaves to the judgment of others, the probability of the truth being upon the side of Van Vradenburg and the undertaker, with his assistant, or on that of Doctors Swinburne, Sherman, and Bridges, who especially testified to the medico-legal facts in the case, and were corroborated in almost every particular by the notes written at the autopsy, and signed by each of the 15 doctors there present, and also by the evidence of 2 laymen, Freeman and Hitchcock, as to the appearance of the indentation at the second autopsy. Having thus quoted copiously statements and theories of the medical experts from the lengthy report of Dr. Wood, it remains for the narrator to note that their conclusions were not allowed to pass unchallenged by other medico-legal authorities and by the life underwriters. In some cases, conflicting views amounted to little more than presumption. In others, they took shape in positive conviction. Reference has already been made to the belief that Dwight's case was one of substitution, that another body had served a vicarious purpose, and that he had slipped out of a back door and migrated to a warmer latitude. Some of the leading managers of our life insurance companies, feeling assured themselves, plausibly argue to others to this day that soon after Dwight's alleged disappearance he was seen and recognized in Mexico, and afterward in South America, where he lived for several years and finally died. There were parties who offered to capture and produce Dwight, provided they were liberally rewarded, but their offer was not accepted. The chief difficulty to be overcome by the adherents of the substitution theory is that of finding a body so correspondent in height, weight, measure, and remarkable general appearance as to deceive friends and neighbors who could have had no part nor lot in a scheme to defraud insurance companies. Allusion has been made to the failure to question Doctors Orton and Burr, who attended Dwight in his last illness, even after the court had given permission for them to testify. This omission has been a source of lasting regret. With reference to his frequent use, or rather misuse, of fluid extract of galesmium, it is stated that it was originally prescribed to meet malaria indications, and that he was thence led to study its toxic properties and its fatal doses, as well as its remedial applications. Its selection for a suicidal purpose, if the theory of suicide be accepted, was favored by the mistaken notion that the gel semen, the poisonous alkaloid, could not be readily detected by chemical reactions. The characteristic effects of a poisonous dose upon the nervous and muscular systems, upon the vision, and upon the respiration and circulation were noticeable in this case, and if the period of full development was shortened by strangulation by his own hands, or those of an attendant, the end would have been as sure without the rope a little later. The pitcher was already broken at the fountain. With regard to the claims against the insurers, it should be noted here that of the 21 companies interested in resisting payment of Dwight's policies, only one case, as we have already remarked, came to a test trial, that of the Germania, but in that case the final decision of the Court of Appeals in favor of the company was based upon mere technicality, misstatements in the application as to points material to the risk. One by one the companies compromised, until only 9 were left. President William A. Brewer, Jr., of the Washington Life Insurance Company, believed it to be for the interest of life insurance to prevent further scandal arising from repeated trials of this case, and when an offer was made by plaintiffs' attorneys to settle, by advice of the General Counsel of the committee in charge of the matter, Honorable Daniel McGone, Mr. Brewer paid them $18,000 and received the 9 policies surrendered for cancellation. This was a virtual admission that there was no substantial claim. It saved the credit of the companies. It was a good bargain in its avoidance of litigation, inasmuch as no one of the companies could have tried its case singly for $2,000. End of section 81.
Section 82 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies, an authentic record of remarkable cases, by John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. Problematical Cases, Part 4. The Ardlamont Mystery, Part 1. In December 1893, a trial of unusual interest took place in the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh, before the Lord Justice Clerk of Scotland, Lord Kingsbury, and a jury of 15. The prisoner was Alfred John Monson, of Kyles of Bute, and he was arraigned on 2 charges, attempted murder and murder, of a pupil placed in his educational charge, named W.D.C. Hambro. A man going by the name of Scott, but with several aliases, who was not forthcoming, was included in the indictment, which read as follows. Alfred John Monson and Edward Sweeney, alias David, alias Scott, are indicted at the instance of the Honourable John Blair Balfour, Lord Advocate, and the charges against you are 1. That you, having formed the design of causing by drowning the death of Windsor Dudley Cecil Hambro, did, in execution thereof, bore, or cause to be bored, in the side of a boat, a hole, and having plugged or closed the said hole, on August 10th, 1893, you, A.J. Monson, in execution of the said design, did, in Ardlamont Bay, in the Firth of Clyde, while the said boat was in deep water, remove, or cause to be removed, the plug from the said hole, and admit the water into, and did sink the said boat, whereby the said W.D.C. Hambro was thrown into the sea, and you, A.J. Monson and E. Sweeney, did thus attempt to murder him. 2. that on August 10, 1893, at a part of a wood situated about 360 yards or thereby in an easterly or northeasterly direction from Ardlamont House, you, A.J. Monson and E. Sweeney, did shoot the said W.D.C. Hambro and kill him, and you, E. Sweeney, being conscious of your guilt in the premises, did abscond and flee from justice. There being no opening statement by counsel in the Scottish courts, the alleged crime may be thus outlined. 3 years before, Lieutenant Hambro, eldest son of Major D. A. Hambro of Sleephill Castle, Isle of Wight, was placed under the tutelage of Monson, at Risley Hall, Yorkshire. At Whitsuntide, 1893, the family removed to Ardlamont, Kyles of Bute, Scotland, with young Hambro in residence as a pupil of Monson. In August, the man Scott was a visitor at Ardlamont in the ostensible capacity of an engineer of a small steam launch chartered by Monson. On the evening of August 9th, Monson and Hambro were fishing in a small boat off Ardlamont Point when the boat capsized. Hambro could not swim. Monson easily managed to swim to shore, where he got another boat and rescued his companion. Next morning they started out early to shoot. Shortly before 9 o'clock they were seen with Scott entering the home plantation, and soon afterwards a shot was fired. According to the prisoner's statement, he had separated from his companion, and on running up after hearing the shot, and getting no reply to his inquiry as to what he had got, he found Hambro lying dead in the ditch, with a gunshot wound behind his ear. A medical certificate of accidental death was given. Hambro's body was removed to Ventmore and interred in the family vault. On August 30th Monson was arrested, and on September 4th Hambro's body was exhumed. Meantime Scott had disappeared. Monson is well connected, being a son of the late Reverend T. J. Monson, rector of Kirkby-under-Dale. His mother is a daughter of the 5th Viscount Galway. At the time of his arrest he was 33 years of age. 10 years before, he was engaged as an assistant master at Peter Maritzburg. Lieutenant Hambro, who belonged to a very old family, was heir to large estates in the Isle of Wight and elsewhere. Several of the leading members of the Scotch bar were engaged in the trial as counsel for the Crown, and the prisoner was ably defended. The examination of witnesses occupied the court 8 days, more than 6 days being devoted to the evidence called on behalf of the prosecution, while about 2 days and a half sufficed to dispose of the witnesses called for the defense. In the opening case for the Crown, Mr. James Brand, a civil engineer, pointed out the localities of the different events on a large diagram. The plan showed Ardlamont House situated at the north end of an area with woods on 3 sides. The woods on the east side of the house had the appearance of an attenuated triangle, with its base to the north. At the extreme south end of it is the schoolhouse, from which Monson, Scott, and Hambro were seen to enter the wood on the morning of the 10th. Along its eastern boundary is a sunk fence, which, while at places almost level with the wood, has a retaining wall on the east side 4 feet in depth. It was at the northeast corner of this wood that the shooting fatality occurred. Running due west from the spot is a footpath along the side of another dike, ending at the back of the house. Ardlamont Bay is on the southwest of the house, and is also approached by a pathway through a plantation. The theory of the Crown was that Hambro was shot from the wood while walking along the top of the turf dike, and the witness Brand gave in detail the distances from the spot where the body was found to the house and to the gamekeeper's cottage. From the same point to a rowan tree was 6 feet 6 inches, to a beech tree 13 feet 9 inches, and to a lime tree 16 feet 3 inches. These trees were considerably in evidence in the course of the trial, especially the rowan, which, by the way, was a sapling about 10 feet in height. Interest quickened when Mr. Brand came to speak of the height on the trees at which pellets were found, these ranging from 4 feet 8 inches to 5 feet 10 inches on the rowan tree, to 8 feet 8 inches on the lime tree. The wood about the spot in question was described as having trees of moderate size, with tall undergrowth of whins. Over the sunk fence on the low level is a plantation of new wood, with grass and ferns below the retaining wall. In line with the place where the body was found was an opening in the winds, and describing an experiment he had made, Mr. Brand said that by placing a man on top of the dike, he got from the gap in question the man's head, the rowan tree, and the beech tree, all in line behind each other. He maintained that along the top of the turf fence was very good walking. Taken next to Ardlamont Bay by the Solicitor General, he described its features, and said that, except at the horns of the bay, there were no rocks in it on which a boat could strike and founder. Among the most interesting witnesses for the prosecution was Mr. James Macnaughton, an Edinburgh gunmaker. He described the pellet marks on the rowan tree, and stated that their spread was 20 inches measured horizontally. The branches of the lime and the beech, which grew behind the rowan tree, intermingled, and taking these together, the spread of the pellets there was 41 inches. That was rather more than he would have expected, but he accounted for it by the deflection of part of the shot by first striking the rowan tree. From experiments he had made with the Ardlamont guns, and with a gun of his own, he fixed the distance at which a spread of shot could be got, such as he found on the rowan tree, at 22 feet. Walking back from the rowan tree in the line of fire to that distance brought him to an opening in the brushwood beside a whin bush breast high. Then he took an officer the height of Hambro and put him on the spot where the dead man's feet were said to have lain. He raised his gun to his shoulder, and the officer's head came into line with the injured part of the rowan tree. The spot where he stood was about a foot below the level of the ground on which the officer stood, so that the muzzle of his gun being slightly elevated would account for the injuries to the lime and beech being higher up than those of the rowan tree. Had the gun gone off in the ditch or from the top of the wall, the shot could not possibly have taken such a direction as he had indicated. Mr. Macnaughton produced and explained a long series of cardboard diagrams, illustrative of the effects of shot which he had obtained by experimenting with the 2 Ardlamont guns with black powder, Schultz and amberite cartridges such as they had been using at Ardlamont, one fact in connection therewith being that all traces of scorching disappeared after 3 feet. In deliberate tones, and amid a profound silence in court, he gave it as the result of his experiments, and from an examination of the skull, that Hambro had been shot from 9 feet off. Very quietly the Solicitor General then brought out the relation of this fact to the other distance of 22 feet which Mr. Macnaughton had mentioned. From the rowan tree to the spot where Hambro's head was lying was 6 feet 1. From his head to his feet was put down at 6 feet, as he was nearly that height. And adding the 12 feet 1 to the 9 feet, which the witness gave as the distance from which the shot had been fired, the summation was brought up to 21 feet 1 inch. To another question, Mr. Macnaughton gave it as his deliberate view that the wound could not have been self-inflicted, accidentally or otherwise. This evidence made a strong impression on the audience. When it came to the medical testimony, the veteran Dr. Littlejohn detailed the results of the post-mortem examination of the body of young Hambro, exhumed for the purpose, at Ventnor. The wound behind the right ear was of triangular shape with the base towards the face. Its extreme length was 3½ inches. At its base it had a length of 2½ inches. At its middle it was 2 inches, and tapered off posteriorly. A portion of the middle of the right ear had been carried away. On no part of the ragged edges of the wound was there any appearance of blackening, as if from gunpowder or scorching, but 4 minute specks, apparently metallic, and which afterwards, on examination, turned out to be fragmentary portions of lead, were found adhering to the edges. On the scalp being dissected, it was found that over a space of an irregular shape, and measuring 2 inches from before backwards, and fully an inch at its greatest breadth, the bone was wanting. The skull on that side, it was further said, presented a localized shattered appearance, stretching from below the occipital protuberance directly forward in the direction of the ear. The base of the temporal bone was shattered. On the brain being removed and carefully examined, 4 metallic masses of irregular shape, and resembling shot, were found and preserved. A careful autopsy had also been made of the other parts of the body, which were found in a healthy condition. The general conclusion arrived at was that Hambro died from shock, the result of a gunshot wound, and of subsequent loss of blood. Dr. MacDonald Brown, an anatomical expert, said that the main facts elicited in the examination were that the appearance the wound presented was quite inconsistent with the idea that the shot had been fired from below upwards, or from the side, or from the front. The direction of the wound was from behind forward. As the outcome of experiments, they had found that shot fired at any distance nearer than 3 feet produced results totally dissimilar to those found in Hambro's skull, and they were therefore inclined to place the possible distance at which the shot was fired between 3 and 15 feet. But he added that undoubtedly the distance at which they got results approximating those under consideration was 9 feet. Under 5 feet, the head would simply have been blown to atoms. He also gave it as his view that it was absolutely impossible that the injuries had been caused accidentally by Hambro himself. After a special examination of the skull, Dr. Brown summed up his conclusions in 3 propositions. 1. That the pieces of bone found on the dike belonged to Hambro's skull. 2. That the shot which killed him was fired from behind. And 3. That the line of that fire was not far from horizontal. Dr. Heron Watson, who had been a surgeon in the Crimea, gave it as his view that the wound had not been self-inflicted, that the gun had been fired from behind, that the passage of the shot had been almost horizontal, and that 9 feet was the distance from which the shot had been fired. Less than 4 feet would have injured the skull to a greater extent, and at more than 11 or 12 feet they would have looked for separate pellet wounds. He believed that Hambro had been shot and had bled where he was found lying. Corroborative testimony was given by Dr. Joseph Bell, who said that after long thinking the matter over, he had not been able to make out how, either designedly or accidentally, Hambro could have shot himself. The following is a brief summary of the evidence with regard to the insurances which were assumed by the prosecution to supply the motive for the alleged murder. John Graham McLean, district manager of the Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York, explained that Monson called on him in Glasgow on August 2nd and said he was guardian of Hambro, who was coming in for a fortune of £200,000, that Mrs. Monson had advanced £20,000 for the purchase of Ardlamont, and that he would like an insurance on Hambro's life to cover the amount. The policies were, after negotiations, drawn out and signed by Hambro. They were assigned to Mrs. Monson, and a half-yearly premium was paid. One policy for £10,000 was completed, and another was delivered for completion to Mr. Monson on the 8th. Witness learned of the death of Hambro through the press. Witness arranged a meeting with Monson at St. Enoch's Hotel, Glasgow, when Monson gave him a story similar to that given to other witnesses, except that he did not mention that the body lay in a ditch. Monson asked, "How will we go about the claim?" Witness replied, "We will arrange after the funeral." At a later meeting, witness said they must have evidence of death from the fiscal before going further. An important letter was read from Hambro to Mrs. Monson, dated August 7 or 9, agreeing to assign the policies to her in consideration of her advancing the money for the purchase of the Ardlamont estate. A copy of this letter was found among the insurance papers. Mr. David Stewart, resident secretary in Glasgow of the Liverpool and London and Globe Insurance Company, said that on July 25th Monson called in reference to a proposal lodged a few days before for an insurance of £50,000 on Hambro's life. The head office declined to accept the risk. Mr. James Wardle, the Leeds manager of the same insurance company, spoke of a proposal, on May 28th, for an insurance of £15,000 on Mr. Hambro's life. The policy was to be in the name of Monson, whose interest was stated to be to cover certain advances. Another proposal was lodged, this time for £50,000, in the name of Mrs. Monson. The insurance company's directors considered the statement of interest too vague and applied for further details. Monson, in reply, enclosed a letter signed by Hambro, dated July 31st, 1893, acknowledging his indebtedness to Mrs. Monson to the extent of £26,000, and at the same time intimating that, as other arrangements had been made, the proposal for £50,000 would be reduced to £26,000. Monson also stated that Hambro was entitled to a sum of £200,000 under his great-grandfather's life. The insurance was ultimately declined, the directors not being satisfied as to the insurable interest of the proposer in Hambro's life. In cross-examination, the witness admitted that Monson had told him of the transfer by Major Hambro, father of the deceased, of his life interest in the estates to the Eagle Insurance Company, and that he, Monson, had entered into an agreement to buy that interest from the Eagle Insurance Company. William M. Wisely, agent in Glasgow for the Scottish Provident Institution, said his head office in Edinburgh had received a proposal by Monson for £50,000 on the life of another, and witness accordingly on July 11th proceeded to Ardlamont and had an interview with Monson. He understood Monson to be a trustee of Hambro, but was afterwards told by Monson that he was no longer trustee. He was also told that unless an insurance were effected, Monson would be a loser to the extent of £49,000. The proposal for £50,000 on Hambro's life was signed by Mrs. Monson, whose interest was stated to be to cover advances made and liability in connection with the Hambro estates. The company never received proof of Mrs. Monson's insurable interest in young Hambro's life, and the transaction fell through. Monson subsequently intimated that, in consequence of other arrangements, the insurance would be reduced to £10,000 to cover the money actually due from Mr. Cecil Hambro on his attaining 21. Cross-examined. On August 9th, the day before Hambro's death, witness wrote to Monson that, subject to satisfactory evidence of Mrs. Monson's interest, and to the payment of the premium of £180 5s, his company were prepared to issue a policy of £10,000. None of the arrangements had been hidden from young Hambro. Everything was done quite openly. The first proposal had been made by Hambro on his own life. End of section 82. Section 83 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies, an authentic record of remarkable cases, by John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. Problematical Cases, Part 5. The Ardlamont Mystery, Part 2. At the close of the evidence for the defense on the 8th day, Mr. Asher, Solicitor General, addressed the jury. At the outset, he asked for a verdict of guilty on both charges, attempted murder and murder. He told the jury to dismiss from their minds everything except the evidence before the court. He gave a consecutive history of the case and the facts, which formed a complete chain, establishing, as he claimed, link by link the guilt of the prisoner of both crimes. He dealt fully with the negotiations in respect of the life interest in the Hambro estates, on which the Eagle Insurance Company had advanced £37,000, and of the attempt made by Major Hambro, after the foreclosure by the Eagle on the failure of the payment of interest, to effect a rearrangement through Mr. Tottenham, the financial agent, and then himself set out, at length, the financial difficulties in which the Monsons found themselves. Coming to the assurances, he detailed the several attempts made to effect assurances on the life of Cecil Hambro. First came the negotiations with the Scottish Provident Institution for an insurance of £50,000 on Cecil Hambro's life, payable to Mrs. Monson. That was declined because of the failure to prove Mrs. Monson's insurable interest. Then came the proposal for £10,000, the facts from beginning to end supplying no explanation, except that the insurance office was told falsehoods for the purpose of deceiving. The next proposals were to the Liverpool and London and Globe. Here again, the difficulties being too great to be faced, the original proposal was reduced from £50,000 to a smaller sum, to cover money due for his maintenance, extending over 4 years, and also to cover certain liabilities incurred in connection with the Hambro estates. Not one particle of liability in connection with the Hambro estates had been incurred either by Monson or his wife. A letter was sent by Cecil Hambro in these words: "Dear Sir, I am requested by Mrs. Agnes Monson to write you that she has an interest in my life to the extent of £26,000, and I have given her an undertaking in which I have agreed to pay her this sum on my attaining 21. There was an ominous sound about the words that followed, "if I live until then." The insurance companies saw through the flimsiness of the proposals. The Scottish Provident did offer a $10,000 policy, but upon a condition which was never fulfilled, namely, that Mrs. Monson's insurable interest in Hambro's life was proved to their satisfaction. Then there was a change of tactics, and they applied for policies directly in the name of Cecil Hambro. The existence of these policies they persistently concealed until they were put forward after the boy's death with a view to recovering the money. Monson went to the Glasgow office of the Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York for 2 policies of £10,000 each. This impecunious occupant of Ardlamont represented that Mrs. Monson, who had not 2 shillings in her pocket, was going to pay £20,000 for Ardlamont in the interest of young Hambro, and that these 2 policies were to secure her interest. But the premium had to be paid. There was no time to wait until the policies could be got from New York, so the expedient was adopted of taking out a temporary policy, subsisting in any event for 60 days, and upon which the terms of premium were for half a year only. The money for the premium had to be found, and he had to ask the jury's attention closely to the circumstances under which it was found, and they were coming now near to the tragic event. Flagrant misrepresentation and treachery were resorted to by the prisoner. If testimony from human lips was to be believed, Monson resorted to the grossest falsehood ever put upon paper to secure the command of £250, of which he was in sore want at the time. A letter absolutely false was written by Monson to his friend Tottenham, the moneylender, in order to secure the £250 for the purpose of a deposit. He falsely represented that he had purchased the Ardlamont estate, without having even been in communication either with the owner or his agent. The £250 secured by nefarious means was sent by cheque, and placed to Mrs. Monson's account, and on August 8th Monson went to the estate office in Edinburgh in order that there might be something in existence of the nature of negotiations for the purchase of Ardlamont. Having requested the insurance office to get the policy ready by August 8th, he went to Glasgow, carrying in his hand a letter which Cecil Hambro had been persuaded to write, in which he asked that his 2 insurance policies of £20,000 each might be delivered to Mr. and Mrs. Monson, as he had assigned the policies to Mrs. Monson for consideration received. Monson returned to Ardlamont with the policies in his pocket, accompanied by his mysterious friend Scott, whom he introduced to a passenger on the boat as a gentleman from the estate office. On the next day, August 9th, occurred events in connection with which he asked the jury to say that the prisoner was guilty of the crimes alleged against him. The Solicitor General then put before the jury the whole of the events connected with the fishing expedition and the shooting party, and in concluding a speech of 6 hours' duration, said that if the jury agreed with him that the prisoner's tortuous misstatements were only consistent with the theory of his guilt, then they would convict him of the crimes with which he was charged. On behalf of the defense, Mr. Comrie Thompson, in addressing the jury, said he felt that, after careful consideration of the facts, they would be driven to the conclusion that the charge had not been substantiated. He pointed out the difference of opinion between the expert and scientific witnesses, and said the first question they must ask was, "Is it proved?" He felt confident that their answer would be in the negative. He deprecated the action of the newspapers, unintentional though he believed it to be, in creating prejudice in the public mind by the publication of paragraphs about the prisoner. He argued that it was to the interest of the Monsons to keep Cecil Hambro alive, as he was their means of support. Then he dealt with the direction of the fatal shot, and the proximity of the gun barrel, drawing inferences favorable to the prisoner from the evidence on those points. Passing on, he referred to the question of insurances, and submitted that at the time they were negotiated there was a legitimate purpose, and the proposal to insure Cecil was no new idea. The carrying out of Monson's arrangements depended entirely upon the young man living until 1894, and there was no motive for compassing his death. At the time when Cecil Hambro died, there was no obligation by any insurance office in the world to pay money to Monson in respect of his death. Therefore, the whole Crown case, as based upon the insurance, crumbled into dust. The learned counsel next dealt with the charge of attempted murder by drowning. If an attempt to commit murder had been made, Hambro must have noticed it, and in that case, would he have gone home and drunk whiskey and water with the man who attempted to compass his end? Discussing the important question, where was the body first struck down, Mr. Thompson argued that the evidence was consistent with the prisoner's statement, and that the Crown testimony as to the distance and direction of the shot failed utterly. The Crown had said the distance from the muzzle to the wound was 9 feet, but the defense had demonstrated that at such a distance there would be a scattering of pellets, which had not taken place in this case. The Lord Justice Clerk followed with his summing up to the jury. At the outset he observed that the case was purely one of circumstantial evidence, and must be subjected to the minutest criticism. Glancing at the history of the case before the alleged crimes, he said it unbared a very dark side of social life. He then proceeded to analyze the evidence in reference to the alleged transactions for the purchase of Ardlamont. He pointed out that it was in the prisoner's favor that in the letter he wrote to Tottenham asking for £250 to pay the deposit money, he said it might be drawn in favor of Messrs. Anderson, who were agents for the Ardlamont estate. His lordship also observed that though there was a great deal of lying, it was a long way from being dishonest to being murderous. The only weight which the jury should give to these lying episodes should be insofar as they were directly connected with the motive alleged by the prosecution. There was no doubt that about this time the affairs of Mr. and Mrs. Monson were practically desperate. Where evidence was circumstantial only, the question of motive became of enormous importance, for if it were clearly proved, it was of the greatest importance to the prosecution, but if it was displaced, it was vastly in favor of the prisoner. Dealing with the question of Scott, he said he did not think there was any strong evidence of a plot between him and the prisoner, and he could not see any inducement to Scott to be mixed up in the alleged crime. There was something mysterious about his presence at Ardlamont, but it was the duty of the Crown to clear that up. And if they had been unable to find the missing man, no point must be made against the prisoner for their failing to do so. His lordship next reviewed evidence relating to the boating expedition, and said that if the jury believed an attempted murder had been committed, then it would throw considerable light on the proceedings of the next day. Coming to the fatal day, he went with considerable detail through the evidence, and then, commenting on the theoretical evidence, said that unless the jury were satisfied that the pellet marks on the rowan tree were made at the same time as Hambro was shot, then the whole theory of the Crown on that question fell to the ground. The jury retired to consider their verdict at 4 o'clock, and after an absence of 3/4 of an hour, returned into court with a verdict of "not proven." The result was received with cheering, not only by the people in the court, but by a crowd outside in Parliament Square. Not proven is a form of verdict used in Scotland in criminal prosecutions, when the jury think there is some foundation for the charge, but the evidence is not strong enough against the prisoner to warrant a verdict of guilty. A verdict of not proven is substantially a verdict of acquittal. The prisoner cannot be tried afterwards, even though new and conclusive evidence come to light after the verdict. But though the prosecution failed to prove its case, Monson left the dock enveloped by heavy clouds of doubt and suspicion. After the trial, attention was drawn to the issue, who would profit by Cecil Hambro's death? The London Review, in discussing the situation, laying aside question as to the actual criminality in what was undoubtedly a murder, and dealing merely with the insurance aspect, presented the following points for consideration. 1. First, Mrs. Monson. The assignment of Cecil Hambro, it is claimed, was known by Monson to be invalid, and a strong point was made in his favor on this, for the defense and in the summing up. But whether money would come to anyone is the real question at issue. 2. Granting invalidity of the assignment, the next of kin would claim, viz. Major Hambro. Now, Major Hambro was under heavy financial obligations to Monson and Tottenham. Monson also owed money to Tottenham. Money payable to Major Hambro would, therefore, be intercepted by his creditors, viz. Monson, Tottenham, and others, and money payable to Tottenham by Monson would be intercepted by the former. 3. It is obvious, therefore, that assignment or no assignment, Monson would profit by Cecil Hambro's death now, though he might or might not do better at his majority. 4. Tottenham certainly would profit, as he had purchased a judgment against Cecil Hambro, which, being for necessaries, would be a valid claim against next of kin of a minor. 5. Monson and the financiers at the back of Tottenham and Major Hambro were therefore certain to profit by any payment by an insurance company. 6. But here is where the real trouble begins. No less than a dozen life insurance companies were, at various times, approached on the matter of Cecil Hambro's life assurance, and to each and all was the suggestion made of assuring Cecil Hambro's life for the benefit of Mrs. Monson, who professed to have claims for a large amount. To each of the life offices, however, this question of Mrs. Monson's insurable interest proved an insurmountable stumbling block. In the case of the Mutual Life of New York, the same difficulty presented itself, but that was got over by the plan of young Hambro insuring his life in his own name, being at liberty afterwards to properly assign the policies to Mrs. Monson. It seems to have been understood on the side of the insurance companies, and to a more limited extent by Monson, that this assignment by a minor would be invalid unless accompanied by the consent of his father as next of kin and the primary beneficiary, in the event of Cecil Hambro not reaching the age of 21. 7. Now, it was precisely here where Monson overreached himself. Cecil Hambro had been proposed to the Reliance Mutual and had been postponed for medical reasons. In the proposal made to the Liverpool and London and Globe, this episode of the Reliance Mutual was mentioned, and for good reason, namely, that the Liverpool and London and Globe knew all about it already. The Mutual Life of New York was aware of the declinature by the Reliance Mutual, or of the active canvassing among the dozen offices in connection with this proposed assurance. The proposal made to the Mutual, therefore, contained no mention of these various transactions, which, if referred to, would have made the issue of a life policy by that office a somewhat doubtful possibility. It is to be noted that it was on the 2nd of August, on declinature by the Liverpool and London and Globe, that Monson went to the Glasgow office of the Mutual of New York. 8. It follows, therefore, that the proposal made to the Mutual Life of New York was a fraudulent one, and absolutely invalid. But as the ingenious Mr. Loftus Tottenham suggested in the box at Edinburgh, as he was to get £4,000 himself out of the mutual money, there was every reason to try, as it was expressed, to bluff the company. An unfortunate expression, which he afterwards tried to explain, saying that he meant to have a try for the money. Even as the creditor of Major Hambro, the next of kin, all possibility of bluffing the Mutual Life of New York was finished at an interview between Monson, the mutual agent, and the procurator fiscal in the streets of Inverary on the 29th of August. In due course, December 3, 1894, an action was brought in the Queen's Bench Division before the Lord Chief Justice, Sir Charles Russell, and a special jury, by Dudley Albert Hambro, the father and administrator of the estate of Windsor Dudley Cecil Hambro, deceased, against the Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York in respect of 2 life policies of £10,000 each. His lordship reviewed the evidence with great care and at great length, clearly setting forth the breach of warranty, the fraudulent misrepresentations, and their materiality. When he concluded, the jury retired, and, after an absence of half an hour, returned with the following answers to the questions put to them. The application to the Reliance was deferred. The deceased did apply to the Liverpool and London and Globe. He was declined by the latter. He was aware of the unfavorable opinion as to albumin. Fraudulent statements were made, they were material, and they influenced the insurers. Monson was the party substantially affecting the insurance, and with the consent and acquiescence of Cecil Hambro. There was no disposition to press the charge of fraud against Cecil Hambro. His lordship noted that in his opinion the proposal was the basis of the contract, and that if any statement in it was untrue, the policy could not be enforced by anyone. The only effect of the policy being absolutely void would be that the premium paid on it could be recovered. It was immaterial to decide that, but his opinion was that it was void altogether. Judgment would be for the defendants with costs. The Mutual Life Insurance Company showed its readiness from the start to acquit itself of the claim, but as the suspicious circumstances attending the Ardlamont mystery were developed, the management was bound, on grounds of public policy, to decline payment and defend action. Practically, the grounds of resistance were three in number. First, that no action by Major Hambro would lie, because the policies had been assigned to Mrs. Monson. Secondly, that Cecil Hambro had warranted certain statements in his application for insurance as true, which were untrue. And thirdly, that the policies had been obtained by fraud on the part of young Hambro or of Mr. Monson, who was acting as his agent, or rather as the controller of his conduct in the matter of the insurance. Of these contentions, the most important one was the plea that Mr. Cecil Hambro had himself vitiated the policies in question by warranting certain statements in his application for insurance which proved to be untrue. It is pleasant to know that during the whole course of a trial lasting some 3 days, there was not the faintest attempt to prejudice the case by reason of the Mutual Life being an American company. Its action received the distinct and emphasized approval of the British press, both professional and general. Of course, the conditions were different from those where a widow and children, attired in black, are part of the scenery, for here there was only the abstract body of creditors of Major Hambro's estate, Major Hambro having been imported into the business by the purest accident in the world, and against his will even. A few weeks afterward, the hearing of the appeal of Major Hambro from the judgment and verdict of the Lord Chief Justice and the special jury took place in the Court of Appeal, before the Master of the Rolls and Lord Justices Lopes and Rigby. In dismissing the appeal, the Master of the Rolls made short work of it. In the course of his review, he said, Mr. Monson and his wife had taken a young man. He did not want to say much about the wife, for he believed she was just as much under the influence of the man Monson as this young boy, pretending he was to teach him, and got him to Scotland, and by himself, by inducing or compelling his wife to exercise influence over this young man. He seemed to have obtained such an influence over this weak man that he was what the Lord Chief Justice had graphically described as like so much putty in their hands. That was to say, by telling him to do a thing, they made him do it, and he had no will of his own. They could do just as they pleased, and Monson resolved to obtain a very large insurance on his life, and the jury had found that by his influence over him got him to acquiesce in anything that he, Monson, did, and he acquiesced so completely that he allowed Monson to get an insurance on his life in any way or form Monson chose. He proposed to get the insurance by putting it in the name of Mrs. Monson. He said he was the trustee and guardian of this young man, in absolute falsehood. He said he was his tutor. What on earth he taught him, except something bad, he could not say. Monson said this young man was to come into a fortune of £200,000, and had contracted to buy the Ardlamont estate for £48,000, and that Mrs. Monson was lending him money, and therefore she could honestly wish, in order to repay herself, to insure his life. A greater mass of falsehoods was never told by anybody. A difficulty arose as to the time the policy could be got through, and it was suggested, in order to avoid delay, that it should be taken out in Hambro's name, and this was agreed to. What Monson had said about the young man was written down to read to Hambro, and he agreed to it. But Monson was at his back. The policies were obtained by an infamous number of lies, and Hambro's representative could not come forward and say, I know that the policies were obtained by all that Monson said. I know that he is an infamous liar and deceived the company, but I will take the policies and have nothing to do with the lies at all." He was of opinion that Monson was acting as Hambro's agent, and therefore any falsehood told by him could be used against the person for whom he was acting. As to the other questions, he quite agreed with the decision of the Lord Chief Justice. The policy had been obtained by fraud, and therefore the company was not liable. Lord Justices Lopes and Rigby concurred, and the appeal was dismissed with costs. End of section 83.
Section 84 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. An authentic record of remarkable cases by John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. Problematic Cases, Part 6, The Wackerle Puzzle, Part 1. No case within our knowledge has presented such conflicting testimony and led to such opposite conclusions as that of Walburga Wackerle in the prosecution of claims against two prominent insurance companies. The persistence of this woman under the most discouraging circumstances not only elicited sympathy from the public, but even from the officers of the insurance companies who resisted her claims, and it was only from the fullest and firmest conviction that her claims were fraudulent that they were able to resist them. This conviction, forcible from the first presentation of the claim, was strengthened by subsequent and exhaustive examination of the circumstances of the case. The fact that the death of the claimant's husband has never been proven, that the alleged remains were never satisfactorily identified, that another person and not Wackerle was known to have been killed at the time of his alleged death, that Wackerle was found and fully identified by scores of neighbours and friends, that he was a pensioner of the government, were sufficient to justify resistance, no one will deny. On the other hand, there was conflicting evidence as to the identity of Wackerle. His poor memory respecting his children, their names, etc., influenced the jury, no doubt, to render a verdict as they did. The following history of the case we reprint from rough notes in the Annapolis, by permission of the publishers. In Carver County, Minnesota, lived a plain, honest German farmer by the name of William Wackerle. Through his economical habits and untiring industry he accumulated sufficient to purchase a farm and live comfortably upon it. At the call of the government for troops to suppress the Northern Secession movement, he enlisted and became a member of Company H, 9 Regiment, Minnesota Volunteer Infantry. He served 2 years in the Union Army and was discharged on account of sickness. In the year 1867 he sold his farm and other property for $3,000, the proceeds of which Mrs. Wackerle took. They moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where, under the persistent importuning of his wife, he insured his life for $3,000 in the Aetna Life Insurance Company of Hartford, Connecticut, and $4,000 in the Mutual Life of New York. The policies were made payable, in the event of his death, to his wife, Walburga Wackerle. Soon after obtaining the insurance, they moved to Detroit, Michigan. They had resided but a short time at the latter place, when Wackerle left his family and, it appears, went to California. His wife followed him there, and through advertising found him at Sacramento. Subsequently they came east, and took up their residence in Quincy, Illinois. They had resided there but a little while when Wackerle again left home for parts unknown. This was in the latter part of the year 1871. After waiting over a year and not hearing from her husband, Mrs. Wackerle again started in pursuit of him. When she arrived in St. Louis, she called upon John Wackerle, his brother, for the purpose of ascertaining, if possible, where William had gone. As John knew the trials his brother had endured, and that he intended to abandon his wife, he told her he believed her husband had gone south. She immediately started upon the supposed trail. When she arrived in Shreveport, Louisiana, she got information that the year previous, December 25th, 1872, a man was killed on the Texas Pacific Railroad by being run over by a train of cars, 9 miles from that city. Assuming that it was her husband, she commenced at once to procure evidence to that effect. The agent of the Etna Company at Shreveport furnished her with blanks indicating what was necessary to establish his identity and death. In February 1874, Mrs. Wackerle visited the Etna office in Hartford with the proofs of death. She represented to the officers of the company that she was very poor, and that she had endured great hardships in getting the proofs and reaching Hartford. Her general appearance indicated the truthfulness of her statements. She was told by the president of the Etna that the company was entitled to 90 days in which to investigate the justness of the claims, and if found correct it would be paid promptly when due. Mrs. Wackerle also presented the claim to the Mutual Life of New York, and was told by that company that as the Etna was to make an investigation of the case, it would wait the action of that company and be governed by its conclusions. The proofs of death furnished by Mrs. Wackerle were incomplete and unsatisfactory, and the justness of the claim could only be determined by an investigation. 2 affidavits identified the party killed as Wackerle. In one the deponent was made to say that on the 25th of December 1872, a man by the name of William Wackerle, well known to the deponent, having worked with him on Section 2 of the Texas Pacific Railroad, was killed by being run over by the freight train, and further says that he saw said Wackerle after his death and knows him to have been the same party he knew alive by that name. The other affidavit stated that on the 25th of December 1872, one William Wackerle, a labourer on the Texas Pacific Railroad, was killed at a place about 9 miles from the city of Shreveport by being run over by a train of the Texas Pacific Railway Company. That he was present and saw said William Wackerle deceased when his body was sent to Shreveport for coroner's inquest and interment. That he has frequently heard the deceased spell his name Weckerle to deponent. The certificate of death and burial gave the name of the deceased as unknown. Mrs. Wackerle furnished other affidavits in which it was stated that a man was killed on the 25th of December 1872, and they have since heard and been led to believe it was William Wackerle. The companies had every reason to believe that a man had been killed upon the railroad near Shreveport, as alleged, but the evidence showing it was Wackerle and the husband of the claimant was of a questionable character, to say the least. In order to ascertain the facts, an employee of the Etna went to Shreveport and made careful inquiry. He ascertained that the 2 affidavits identifying Wackerle as the party killed were made by ignorant freedmen, who could neither read nor write. When the affidavits they had made were read to them, they declared that their ignorance had been taken advantage of, and what the affidavits contained was not true. They simply intended to state that a man was killed on the Texas Pacific Railroad on the 25th of December 1872. The man killed belonged to a gang of construction hands employed by the railroad, and at the time the engine struck him he was lying drunk upon the track. The body was taken to Shreveport and an inquest was held in the evening. As no one appeared to identify the body, it was buried as one unknown. The verdict of the inquest was to the effect that no blame was attachable to the employees of the road. The imposition practised upon the freedmen, together with other circumstances which will appear hereafter, led the company to pursue the investigation with a view of learning, if possible, who the party was that was killed. It was found that the name of William Wackerle did not appear on the payroll of the railroad, and this fact was certified to by the roadmaster, paymaster, assistant treasurer, and foreman of the gang to which the man who was killed belonged. The roadmaster made affidavit that to the best of his knowledge and belief, William Wackerle was not in the employ of the Texas Pacific Railroad Company as alleged, and that he knows of no such man having been killed on said road, but to his best knowledge and belief, the only man killed on said road about the time, at or near the place at which it is said William Wackerle was killed, was a man named Frank Ettin, who was an employee of the road at said time. The paymaster of the road stated, under oath, that the name of William Wackerle did not appear on any of the payrolls of said company, as an employee or otherwise, and that to his best knowledge and belief The men killed by the train on or about the 25th of December 1872, at or near the place where it is said that William Wackerle was killed, was a man by the name of Frank Ettin, who was at the time of his death an employee of the Texas Pacific Railway Company. The foreman of the gang of men engaged in track repairs on the Texas Pacific Railroad, to which the party killed belonged, made affidavit that on or about the 25th of December 1872, one Frank Ettin was killed by a train going east, near Shreveport, and there was no other man killed during that day or at that place, that he knew the men killed personally, he having belonged to his gang for about 3½ months, and during that time was under his direction. Frank Ettin was a native of Belgium. He also stated that he never knew any man by the name of William Wackerle. Frank Ettin was about 5 feet 6 1/2 inch high, fair hair, grey eyes, light complexion and whiskers inclined to be of reddish tinge. He further stated that when Mrs. Wackerle first came to him, she described her husband as 5 feet 10 or 11 inches in height, weight 180 to 190 pounds, high forehead, high cheekbones, black hair and eyes. He told her that the man killed was not her husband. During the investigation Mrs. Wackerle remained in Hartford. She made special effort to extend her acquaintance and enlist the sympathy of the leading citizens of the city. The rehearsal of her trials in getting the proofs and of the difficulties of her long journey to make personal application to the company for the insurance was very interesting, and in the absence of knowledge of the facts would generally be accepted and believed. With the information the company had, there was no course to pursue but to decline to pay. There was the clear evidence that the man killed was not her husband, but a man by the name of Frank Ettin. Mrs. Wackerle denounced the company in unmeasured terms because of its refusal to recognise and pay her claim, and from the people to whom she related her story she obtained much sympathy. She returned to Shreveport with a view of perfecting the proof of her husband's death. Along the route she permitted representatives of the press to interview her respecting her grievances, and columns were printed denouncing the companies for refusing to pay. Patrons of life insurance entered their protests against the position taken by the companies, claiming that it was calculated to discredit the business. At this time Mrs. Wackerle had other strings to her bow. There was due to the man Ettin, at the time of his death, for services to the Texas Pacific Railroad, the sum of $40. The amount was paid to another labourer claiming to be a cousin of Ettin. If she was successful in establishing the fact that her husband was the man killed upon the railroad, it was her intention to pursue the road, not only for the $40, but also for damages for killing him. She made demand at the general office of the road, in Philadelphia, for the $40. Although the sum had been previously paid, to prevent the annoyance she gave the officers, they offered to pay her $40 provided she would sign a receipt releasing the road from all liability for damages. She declined to sign the receipt they requested, and denounced the officers for attempting such an imposition on her. She informed them they would yet have to pay smartly for attempting to cheat her. During her travels Mrs. Wackerle ascertained that a certain bounty was paid by the government to its discharged soldiers if applied for within a certain time. The limitation had expired before she became aware of the law granting the extra bounty. She went to Washington and insisted upon her claim being recognised. She told the story of her hardships, about her claims on the insurance companies and the railroad. As the widow of Mr. Wackerle, who was a faithful soldier, she demanded of the government that in some way it pay her the bounty to which she would have been entitled if applied for in time. The Secretary of War yielded to her solicitations and wrote a letter directed to the Committee on Claims, advising that a special act be introduced into Congress granting her, as the widow of Wackerle, a bounty. Press of business prevented the introduction of the bill, and it went over to the next Congress. Mrs. Wackerle's trip to Shreveport was followed by the customary newspaper assaults upon the insurance companies. She brought suit against the Aetna Life in the District Court of Caddo Parish, Louisiana. Messrs. Looney and Elstner, attorneys at Shreveport, acted for her, and Messrs. Alexander and Bell were employed by the company. The cause came up for trial before Judge A.D. Land. The trial was of unusual length, and elicited much interest among the people of Shreveport and vicinity. Some of the testimony introduced by the plaintiff was of a questionable character. Several of the witnesses had unenviable reputations, and it was shown in court that they were not worthy of confidence. It was admitted by the company that a man was killed, but it claimed that it was not Wackerle. The court and jury, however, concluded that as there was some indirect testimony to the effect that it was Wackerle, and as the widow insisted that it was her husband, they would give her the benefit of the doubt, and a verdict was given in her favour. The Etna attorney immediately gave notice of an appeal to the Supreme Court of Louisiana, July term, 1878. After the trial, Mrs. Wackerle again visited Hartford and New York with a letter from one of her attorneys directed to the Etna Company, in which he urged that the appeal be withdrawn. He stated that he recognized the company's right to know that the man killed was the identical party it insured. Having established that fact to the satisfaction of the District Court, he relied on the high reputation of the company for fair dealing not to pursue this woman any further. Mrs. Wackerle's trip north was followed by another strain of newspaper abuse of the companies. An item appeared in the New York Mail referring to the case, which came to the notice of a Mr. Joseph Weinman of Faribault, Minnesota. He recognized the name of William Wackerle as a member of his company in the 9th Minnesota Regiment, and immediately wrote to the publishers of the Mail that he could give the company important information if put in correspondence with it. The letter was forwarded to the Etna, and an adjuster was immediately sent to Faribault for the purpose of ascertaining what Mr. Weinman knew respecting the case. The adjuster found that Mr. Weinman was a respectable citizen, and during the war was first lieutenant of Company H, 9th Regiment Minnesota Volunteers, and that William Wackerle was a member of his company for about 2 years. He had known Wackerle well, and had been in correspondence with him for some time, Wackerle's object in writing Mr. Weinman being to obtain his assistance in procuring a pension from the Government. Mr. Weinman showed the adjuster a letter he had recently received from Wackerle, written in California, in which he said: "I would ask you to make some inquiries about my wife. Can you find out her whereabouts? She used to live in Quincy, Illinois, and I have heard that she married again. I was insured in 2 life insurance companies because she forced me to, and I did it to have peace with her, but it grew worse afterwards, and had I not left her, I would be dead long ago. I left her everything, bed, clothes, and the money of my land, and what I had earned. I worked for my passage to California." End of section 84. Section 85 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. An authentic record of remarkable cases. By John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. Problematic Cases, Part 6. The Wackerle Puzzle, Part 2. While the officers of the company had not believed that Mr. Wackerle was dead, this was the first reliable information they had received of his whereabouts. A representative of the company and Lieutenant Weinman at once started for California, and on arriving at San Francisco found that Wackerle was some 200 miles up the coast in Humboldt County. A friendly telegram was sent which brought him to them. He was found to be the identical William Wackerle whom the company had been searching for so long. He gave to the Etna's representatives his reasons for leaving his wife, among other things because he considered her a desperate woman, and he was afraid she would take his life for the purpose of obtaining the insurance. The following affidavit was made by Mr. Wackerle: State of California, County of San Francisco. William Wackerle, of Hydesville, in the County of Humboldt and State of California, being duly sworn, deposes and says that he was born in Germany on the 20th day of June, A.D. 1826, that his father's name was John Michael Wackerle, and that his mother's name was Jacobina Wackerle, that on the 14th day of November, A.D. 1858, in the town of Shakopee, in the State of Minnesota, he was married to Walburga Schneider, daughter of Antonio and Magdalene Schneider, and the marriage ceremony was performed by Cornelius Weissman, a Catholic priest. that he resided in the said state of Minnesota until about the year 1865, that he was a member of Company H, 9th Regiment Minnesota Volunteer Infantry, that he moved his family to Milwaukee, in the state of Wisconsin, and while a resident of said Milwaukee, he made application for, and received of the Aetna Life Insurance Company of Hartford, Connecticut, a policy of insurance on his life for the sum of $3,000, payable in the event of his death to his wife, Walburga Wackerle, that he subsequently moved with his wife to Detroit in the state of Michigan. While residing in Detroit he surrendered the said policy of insurance or discontinued payments under same, and took from said company in its stead another policy of same amount, $3,000, and payable to his wife, the said Walburga Wackerle, in the event of his death, the latter policy dated May 1869. That he left his wife and went to Sacramento in the state of California, that she subsequently came to the place where he was then living, that in company with his wife they went to Quincy in the state of Illinois, and there resided together till the year 1871, when he again left his wife and went to Sacramento in the state of California, and is now residing in Hydesville in the state of California, and that he does not know the whereabouts of said Walburga Wackerle, not having heard from her for several years. Signed, William Wackerle. Subscribed and sworn to before me this 24th day of June, A.D. 1878. Signed, John Hamill, Notary Public. While the adjuster and Mr. Weinmann were waiting for the arrival of Mr. Wackerle, two German brothers by the name of John Hein and J.N. Hein, formerly residents of Minnesota and neighbours of Wackerle, and who knew him and his wife intimately, were found in San Francisco, and arrangements were made for them to meet Wackerle upon his arrival. Immediately upon the landing of the steamer, the four gentlemen in question recognized each other, and had a long talk relative to incidents which had occurred in their experience in Minnesota while living as neighbours. Affidavits of Weinmann and of the two Heins were taken, which fully corroborated that made by Wackerle. All of the gentlemen went to a photographer, and their pictures were taken separately and also in a group. These papers and photographs were forwarded to Attorney Bell at Shreveport, for the purpose of being presented at the hearing of the case, which was to come up in a few days on the appeal. The facts set forth in Wackerle's affidavit accorded with the statements made by his wife. Wackerle related to the adjuster in an unhesitating and straightforward manner his experience while living with her, many incidents of which Mrs. Wackerle had previously given and were known to the adjuster. Upon the presentation to the Court of Appeals of the evidence that Wackerle was living, the judge granted a new trial, but with the understanding that the company would only be permitted to prove the fact. A commission was issued for the taking of testimony, and Mrs. Wackerle was notified to appear in Carver, Minnesota, and meet the husband she had so persistently claimed was dead. In the meantime Wackerle was sent for, and he immediately came east. He visited his old neighbours and friends in Carver and Chaska, Minnesota, all of whom promptly recognized him. Mrs. Wackerle went to Minnesota, but for reasons best known to herself she would not be present when the depositions were taken. She evaded several attempts to get her and Wackerle together. When Lieutenant Weinmann and Wackerle were in pursuit of Mrs. Wackerle at St. Paul to bring about a meeting of the couple, they accidentally met John Wackerle, William's brother. Both at once recognized each other. This added another link to the chain of evidence so rapidly forming to defeat the unjust claim of the woman that she was a widow and entitled to the insurance upon the life of her deceased husband. The testimony of some 25 witnesses was taken, in Carver and Chaska, to the effect that they knew Wackerle and his wife, and that they knew him to be the identical person who had previously resided there. Some of the witnesses were present at their marriage, others served with him in the army. Mrs. Wackerle persistently refused to meet her husband. It was, however, important to complete the evidence which the company desired to give at the second trial, that Mrs. Wackerle should also be identified as the wife of Wackerle and the plaintiff in the litigation. In order to accomplish what was desired in this respect, Lieutenant Weinmann, who, as stated above, was a resident of Faribault, and with whom Wackerle was stopping, arranged with a prominent county official at Chaska that if she visited that place to take her in and telegraph him, in order that he might bring Wackerle and have them meet in the presence of parties who knew them both. The arrangement was successful, and Wackerle, for the first time in many years, met his wife in the presence of a large number of their old neighbours, who subsequently gave testimony that they knew them both, and that they were the identical parties who were formerly residents of that town. When Wackerle and his wife met, he said to her, "Do you now say that I am not your husband, and that I am dead?" To which Mrs. Wackerle replied, "The courts of Louisiana will decide whether or not you are my husband. I want nothing to do with you." Mrs. Wackerle immediately left the house and the town, apparently indignant that she had been compelled to face her husband. At the second trial in Shreveport, the company presented the depositions of Wackerle, Lieutenant Weinman, John Wackerle, and some 25 others, prominent residents of Chaska County, all showing conclusively that Wackerle was living. In rebuttal of the evidence presented by the company to the effect that Wackerle was living, Mrs. Wackerle caused the body of the man killed at Shreveport to be exhumed, and although the burial had occurred some 4 or 5 years before, she testified that she recognized the corpse as that of her husband. She was positive in her testimony of the fact that it was the body of her deceased husband. Notwithstanding there was nothing left but the skeleton, she said that she recognized it from peculiarities of the teeth which she remembered, and that they were identical with those of her husband. The evidence that Wackerle was living was so conclusive that a verdict was given for the company. To this she took an appeal. At the October 1880 term of the Supreme Court it was finally disposed of. In closing his opinion the judge said: "The testimony conclusively establishes that Wackerle, the identical person whose life was insured, is still living, and unmasks one of the boldest and most scandalous schemes of fraud upon the defendant, the court, and her counsel, ever conceived, and carried to the very verge of success. It is therefore ordered, adjudged, and decreed that the judgment appealed from be affirmed at the appellant's costs." So far as the Etna was concerned, this ended the litigation. The suit against the Mutual Life Insurance Company was brought by Mrs. Wackerle in St. Louis. The jury was composed exclusively of farmers. A.R. Taylor of St. Louis was counsel for the plaintiff, and Messrs. Grover and Shepley were counsel for the company. Mr. Taylor opened the case by outlining to the jury the particulars of the claim. A suit was originally brought in State court, but had been transferred by the defendants to the Federal court. Mrs. Wackerle, being sworn, related the facts, mainly as given, respecting the Etna case, and swore that she first learned of her husband's death through his brother, John Wackerle. She met him at Carondelet, and he told her that her husband was dead. Subsequently she went to Shreveport and had her husband's body exhumed, and identified it by broken tooth and by his hair, whiskers, and clothing. She was sure it was the body of her husband. He was killed December 25th, 1872, and she had his body dug up in March 1874. Upon cross-examination she said that she received a note from her lawyer at Shreveport that tried the case against the Etna, telling her that a lawyer named Weinman had a man at Faribault, Minnesota, that was said to be her husband; that she went to see about it. She called on the chief of police there, and he told her to go to Mr. Dunham's, where the man would be. She told him she wanted to see the man they said was her husband, and that he should bring him to her. He did not bring him to her, but brought him in front of the house, and she saw him. She did not call him in, because he was a stranger to her. She did not think that the man said to be her husband saw her at the time she saw him. At a Mr. Grainer's she met the man they said was her husband. There were a good many there, but she did not know who they were. Lawyer Weinman was there. The man said, "Walburga, don't you know me?" She replied that the matter had to be settled in court. She did not tell him he was an impostor. At this point John Wackerle confronted the witness, and she was asked if she recognized him. She replied she had never seen him before. She stated that he was a stranger to her, and she knew nothing about him; that John Wackerle, the brother of her husband, was a taller man, and looked altogether different. William Wackerle was then called in front of the witness, and she was asked if she recognized him. Her reply was, "This man is a stranger to me, like the one before. I saw him once in Minnesota, but he has changed some from what he was before. This man is not my husband. I never lived with him as his wife. I never saw him except in Minnesota once and here now." Here the plaintiff rested her case. Mr. Shepley, counsel for the defence, in his opening address to the jury, said that he expected to prove that the chief of police at Faribault took William Wackerle by the house where Mrs. Wackerle was, and that she went to the chief of police and asked him the quickest way she could get out of the town without that man seeing her; that 2 interviews were arranged at Carver and Chaska, where the parties had lived and were known to many persons, and that it was only by a trick that Mrs. Wackerle was got to the house of one Greiner, where Mr. Wackerle was, and where many persons who knew them both were; that at that time Mrs. Wackerle made no pretence of calling Mr. Wackerle an impostor; that all she could be got to say was that the matter must be settled in the court. He also stated how Weinmann became aware of the litigation with the Aetna Life Insurance Company, how he wrote the company informing them of the existence of Mr. Wackerle. He also stated that he should produce witnesses before the court who knew Mr. Wackerle ever since 1850, before he was married, and down to the present time, and would present overwhelming proof that the person claiming to be William Wackerle was the identical person who was insured, and the husband of the plaintiff, but that he was now divorced from her. Jacob Zomer, sworn, stated that he lived in Illinois, had previously lived on Tom Allen's place, near St. Louis, for 18 years. He was a gardener. He had known William Wackerle since he was a little boy, knew him in the old country, saw him in St. Louis in 1871, was told by Wackerle that he was going south, saw Mrs. Wackerle once. She came to see him and asked him if he knew where her husband had gone. In the spring of 1872 Wackerle came back and said he was going to California. He knew that the party in the courtroom who claimed to be William Wackerle was the identical person, and that John Wackerle was also the brother of William. He was acquainted with him. He had known John Wackerle for 18 years. They were neighbours in the old country. He had played with William when they were boys. Mrs. Wackerle came to him and asked him if he knew where her husband had gone. He told her he did not know, but that he said he was going south. Upon cross-examination he stated that Wackerle left Germany about 10 years before he did, and was about 10 years older than he was. When he met Wackerle in this country he knew him right away, and Wackerle knew him. End of section 85. Section 86 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. An authentic record of remarkable cases by John B. Lewis and Charles E. Bombaugh. Problematic Cases, Part 6. The Wackerle Puzzle, Part 3. John Bruch was sworn and stated that he lived in St. Louis, that he had known William Wackerle about 30 years, that in 1851 Wackerle boarded with him. In 1854 Wackerle went to Minnesota. He recognized William Wackerle in the courtroom as the identical person. He was certain of it. In October 1871 Wackerle boarded with him a couple of weeks. That was at the time he returned from the South. Wackerle returned to St. Louis in April 1872 and boarded with him again a week or 10 days. He then left to go to California. He saw him off. He had not seen him since till about a week ago. He knew John Wackerle, his brother. John had boarded with him more or less since 1851. In 1873 Mrs. Wackerle came to his house and asked if he could tell her anything about her husband, William Wackerle. He told her he did not know where he was, but that John Wackerle was there and was eating his dinner. At the interview between John and Mrs. Wackerle, the former got excited and told her to go off, that he wanted nothing to do with her, that he, Bruch, had not seen her since, until recently, that he knew Christian Wackerle, a brother of William and John. J.A. Sargent was sworn and stated that he lived in Carver, Minnesota, and had resided there since 1855. That in 1859 he was recorder of deeds. He had subsequently been a judge of probate for 14 years. He knew William Wackerle at Carver. In 1862 he enlisted in the war. and was gone till 1864, when he returned. At about that time he, Wackerle, sold his farm and moved away. William Wackerle, then before him, was the identical person. While Wackerle was a resident of Carver, he bought wood of him and did most of his business for him. Wackerle's first wife died about the year 1855, and he married again, and the plaintiff in this case is the woman who lived with Wackerle at Carver and Chaska as his wife. He knew John Wackerle, but not as well as he did William. It was his impression that the identical John Wackerle was before him, that Mrs. Wackerle was in Chaska in 1878, William Wackerle was also there, but he did not see them together. Mrs. Margaret Brutch, wife of the former witness, John Brutch, being sworn, gave testimony similar to that of her husband. She identified William Wackerle and his wife. At this point a number of depositions were read from persons who had known William Wackerle in Chaska, Faribault and Carver, Minnesota, fully identifying the men produced with the William Wackerle they knew. A large number of depositions were presented by the defence and read in court, all having reference to the identification to William Wackerle. J.S. Randall, of Shreveport, an undertaker, was sworn and stated that on the 25th of December 1872 he was called upon to bury a man who was killed on a railroad near Shreveport; that he buried the corpse the next day in the potter's field, in a cheap coffin with a glass plate. He was present at the disinterment of the body in September 1877. He found but little left except the skeleton. There was a little piece of wood that resembled the coffin, and no glass at all was found. William Fletcher, of Shreveport, was sworn, and stated that he took up the body of a man said to have been killed on the railroad about 5 years before. There were no exterior signs of a grave there. He dug on the spot indicated by the sexton. Mrs. Wackerle was present and identified the remains by a broken tooth. The grave was afterwards opened, and the remains appeared in the same condition as before. The leg bones were not broken. Dr. James F. Ford, of Shreveport, stated under oath that he was present at the opening of the grave in 1877, that he examined the bones carefully, and there was no sign of a broken leg. The bones were well preserved, and could not have been in the condition they were if a leg had been broken. R. L. Simmons, of Shreveport, foreman of the coroner's jury that sat on the men killed on the 25th of December 1872 on the railroad, said it was satisfactorily shown that the man belonged to a gang of railroad men, but his name could not at that time be ascertained. There were no papers or name found on the body, or anything by which he could be identified. The first time he ever heard the name of Wackerle was when he met Mrs. Wackerle at the time she was getting up testimony of her husband's death. The leg of the man the inquest was held on was severed just above the knee. W. H. Noland, of Shreveport, testified that he was at the inquest before mentioned, that no papers were found on the body. He never heard the name of Wackerle till he heard it from Mrs. Wackerle. John Hine testified that he had lived in Napa County, California, since 1860. Previous to that he lived in Carver, Minnesota. He knew William Wackerle then. On the 24th of June, 1878, he saw the same William Wackerle at San Francisco and talked over with him old family matters. He stated that he was as positive as he could be of anything that it was the same man. J. Nicholas Hine, a brother of the last witness, testified to the same state of facts. Philip Fabel testified that he had lived in St. Paul since 1856. He was acquainted with William Wackerle when he lived at Carver, Minnesota. He met him again in 1878. Mr. Wackerle came up to him and said, "Don't you know me, Philip?" I said, "No, I don't." He said, "Don't you remember selling me a dog at Carver for a bushel of corn?" I answered, "Yes, I do. Your name is William Wackerle." Paul Faber, of St. Paul, testified that he knew William Wackerle before and after the war. He, Wackerle, was at his house about 2 years ago, and took his meals there occasionally for about a week. His wife, Mrs. Wackerle, came to him, Faber, to help her get testimony on her husband's death. She said she would give him $500 if he would help her. About a week later Wackerle came in, and I exclaimed, "Hello, Wackerle, I thought you were dead." I am positive it was the same William Wackerle I had known at Carver. His wife came to my house later, and I told her to go out. I said to her, "I know your husband, and I wonder how you dare to deny him." Mrs. Paul Faber, wife of the preceding witness, testified to the same state of facts. John Sandren, of Carver, Minnesota, testified that he was in the army with William Wackerle and in the same company with him, saw him in 1878 and talked with him about the campaign they had passed together. Wackerle was familiar with all things they knew together, and talked and answered correctly. He recognized him fully as William Wackerle. Depositions were read of Anthony Waldman, John Funk, Michael Hall, John Blosdell and wife, Mrs. Genevieve Bush, A.G. Anderson, W.A.G. Griffin, Levi H. Griffin and Frederick Greiner, all of Carver, Minnesota. Margareta Ebbinger of Chaska, Senator C.D. Gilfillan of St. Paul's, S.C. Dunham, Chief of Police of Faribault, and Stephen Colk and wife of St. Paul, fully identifying Wackerle as the husband of the plaintiff. Joseph Weinmann, being duly sworn, stated that he resided at Faribault, that he lived in Carver for 18 years, and until 1874 that he was acquainted with William Wackerle, who was at that time living between Chaska and Carver. He knew his wife also, knew them both till 1862. He recruited a company, and August 2nd of that year William Wackerle enlisted. He, Wackerle, served in his company till they came back from Rolla, Missouri, and on account of sickness was discharged. He, Wackerle, sold his farm and moved away from Carver. He did not learn anything of his whereabouts until the year 1873, when he got a letter from him saying he had taken a claim in California and wanted him to attend to it. He answered the letter, and the letter being produced in court was identified by Mr. Weinmann. It is dated September 19th, 1873. He received another letter from Wackerle dated January 22nd, 1873. That letter he produced in court. It was written in German, and Mr. C. E. Söst, Deputy U.S. Marshal, read it in court as an interpreter. It proved to be mostly about the family affairs of the writer. He said he got insured in the Aetna for $3,000, and in the Mutual for $4,000. That he did it because his wife forced him, and he wanted peace. That if he hadn't left her, his life would have been ended long ago. That he heard she had been married again, and wanted to learn something about it. That when he went away, he left all his property he had got for his place and all he had earned. Mr. Weinmann stated further that he did not answer this letter, that he took up a New York weekly mail one day, and looking over the items saw that Mrs. Wackerle had brought suit against an insurance company for the insurance upon the life of her husband. He wrote the editor that he would like to be put in correspondence with the company interested. In about 2 weeks a representative of the Aetna came to Faribault to learn what he knew about the case. He gave him information as to the Wackerles' whereabouts. The letter was shown to the Aetna representative, and upon being compared, the signature of the letter and of the application for insurance were found to be identical. That he and the Aetna representative visited California and found Mr. Wackerle there. Upon cross-examination, Mr. Weinmann stated that when he first became acquainted with the case, Mrs. Wackerle had obtained a judgment against the Aetna. That he did not know where Christopher Wackerle was, he had not heard from him for years. That he knew William Wackerle as well as he knew any man except his, Weinmann's, brother. That Wackerle did not learn from him about his domestic affairs. That William Wackerle and John Wackerle, his brother, were the parties whom they represented themselves to be, and William was the husband of the plaintiff. John Wackerle testified that he was a brother of William, who was then present. He knew Walburga Wackerle, the plaintiff. He saw her in St. Louis 9 or 10 years ago. It was at John Brach's salon in Carondelet. She wanted to know where his brother William was. He said he did not know where he was. He went south somewhere, perhaps to Texas. The next spring William went to California, he thought. Did not remember exactly. He next saw William in St. Paul in 1878. He did not see him again until he came here. On cross-examination he stated that he did not tell Mrs. Wackerle that her husband was dead, that he never heard his brother was in Marshall, Texas, working on a farm, that he never received a letter from his brother Christian, that he did not know where Christian was, that he, John, was never at Shreveport. William Wackerle, being duly sworn, stated that he resided in California, that he went there in the year 1869 from the country back of Detroit, that he worked on I Street in Sacramento making wine, that he was married in Minnesota to Walburga Wackerle, and he guessed she knew him then. He lived there till 1865. His wife lived with him then. That when he sold his farm she took every cent of money he got for it, and all he had earned. That he had had so much trouble with this woman he should always remember her. He sold his farm to George Gruber and partner. That he moved to Milwaukee. While there he took out a policy in the Aetna, first for $2,000, and it was afterwards made $3,000. His wife left Milwaukee before he did and took everything to Detroit. He was also insured in a New York company for $4,000. Both were for his wife's benefit. He did not stay long in Detroit. His wife quarrelled with him. He returned to Milwaukee. His wife wrote him requesting him to live with her again, and he did. While in Detroit he earned money to go to California. While at Sacramento he, through an advertisement, learned that a woman wanted to meet him. He met his wife at Schimminger's. They took a house there and lived together a while. She desired to go east, and together they went back to Quincy, Illinois, while in Sacramento a child died and was buried there. His wife desired to take the child with them east, and she had some trouble with the railroad company about taking it. They arrived in Quincy in 1870. While there he chopped wood for a man by the name of Ben Franklin. They lived together in Quincy until the year 1871. In the fall of that year he went to New Orleans. In the spring of 1872 he came back and boarded about 2 weeks with John Brutch of St. Louis, and from there went to California by the overland route. At Sacramento he met his brother Christopher. He next went to Eureka, California in 1873, and from there to Hydesville, and resided there till 1878, where at the request of the Aetna Company he returned to Minnesota. During the time from 1873 to 1878 he wrote letters to Joseph Weinman of Faribault. His letters were presented and identified. During the war Mr. Weinman was first lieutenant of his company. In 1880 he went to Los Angeles, California to live, and now resides there. After leaving his wife at Quincy, he next saw her in the fall of 1878 at Chaska, Minnesota, and she pretended not to recognize him. It was at Griner's house. He asked her if she did not know him, and she would not answer. She said she would have nothing to do with him, and the courts must decide. After leaving her at Quincy, Illinois, he never wrote to her. He left her because he could not live with her in peace. He wanted some peace in his old age. Upon cross-examination he said that when he met his wife at Mr. Griner's, she said we were all swindlers. Mr. Griner said, "Who is a greater swindler than you? You want to collect the insurance money, and your husband is not dead." That the child's body was carried by the express company, the railroad company refusing to take it. He would have preferred to have the child buried in California, that his wife made all the arrangements as to the preserving and shipping the corpse. That the coffin used was a plain one, such as poor people generally get. They arrived in Quincy before the coffin did. The outer box was not opened to his knowledge. It was buried, so far as he knew, in the same condition that it arrived. There were 8 children born at his last marriage. They all died young, except the girl at Sacramento, who was 7 or 8 years old when she died. The first child was born on the farm in Minnesota. Its name was George William. It was buried on a lot he bought of Griner. The second child was born at New Orleans and died there. He did not remember its name. She called it William. He did not remember whether the third child was a boy or girl, how long it lived, nor when it died. He did not remember where the fourth child was born, or whether it was a boy or girl. He made the same statements respecting the fifth, sixth, and seventh child, and he did not remember their names. The last child was a boy. It was living when he left Quincy. She called it George. He stated that his wife had a book in which all the names of the children were written down. Some of the names were written by himself. He further stated that he was never in Indianapolis with his wife, that he went from New Orleans to Cincinnati with her, and that he worked in the latter place one season. He had never been there since. End of section 86. Section 87 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. An authentic record of remarkable cases. By John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. Problematic Cases, Part 6. The Wackerle Puzzle, Part 4. The witness was shown a certificate of his examination for an insurance policy dated at Cincinnati in 1868, on a policy he had previously stated he took out in Milwaukee in the year 1867. He did not remember having been in Cincinnati at that time. He could give no reason for being re-examined on a policy taken out in 1867. He stated that he lived in Detroit in 1869. He might have visited Cincinnati, but he did not remember it. He had an indistinct recollection that he did go to Cincinnati, but he could not tell for certain. He stated that his memory was not good, that they had one child, born a couple of months after they arrived at Quincy. It was a boy. He was asked if his wife was not suffering with pains of labour when they got off the cars, and if his wife was not taken to the house of a policeman, and if a child was not born there. He stated that the child was born in the house he rented, that the dead child was buried before the child referred to was born, that he was never shown the depositions which were presented at the trial, that he was never asked to change his name to Christopher Wackerle, that Christopher was a larger and much stouter man, that he, Christopher, was 4 years younger, that he had not seen him since 1873, that he was William Wackerle and the husband of the plaintiff, that the reason why he did not apply for a pension until the year 1878 was that he did not know that a discharged soldier was entitled to a pension, that their children were all young when they died, that his wife paid the premiums for the insurance, the proceeds of the sale of the farm and other property she put into United States bonds. At the close of the depositions, William Wackerle was requested to write his name. The signature compared perfectly with the undoubted signature of William Wackerle in the original application for insurance in the Etna, with only the natural difference which the increased age would make. This closed the evidence for the defence. Upon the part of the prosecution, Dr. Moses S. Bassett of Quincy, Illinois, being sworn, testified that he was a physician and surgeon, had practised 30 years, knew William Wackerle at Quincy, got acquainted with him when he first came there. In the fall of 1870 or 1871 was called one morning by a policeman to see a woman in labour. The policeman stated that he picked the woman up in the street. He sent his stepson, who is a physician, to attend her. A few days later a man came to see him about a baby that was born at the time my stepson attended the case. That man was William Wackerle. The child had an unusual disease for a child. I recognized Mrs. Wackerle here as the mother. I afterwards attended Mr. Wackerle when he was sick. This man here is not the William Wackerle I knew in Quincy. He is 2 inches taller than that man, and has more prominent cheekbones. The William Wackerle I attended had different hair and eyes from this man. He had blue eyes and reddish auburn hair. It was rather long and rolled up at the ends without being curly. He was more effeminate looking than this man. This man has some resemblance to him, but I am positive that he is not the man. George Tenderidge, being sworn, testified that he was a druggist in Quincy. He knew William Wackerle there and saw him frequently. He was satisfied that this was not the man. Wackerle, whom he knew, was not as tall as this man. His face was not as long, nor his forehead the same shape. William Wackerle's forehead was very protuberant. The deposition of J. Henry Heiner was read. It was to the effect that he knew William Wackerle, who resided at Quincy 10 or 12 years ago. He was about 5 feet 6 inches tall. His whiskers were of a bright auburn and his hair a little darker. Wackerle did not shave at all then. Said he could identify him if Wackerle would tell what was the contents of a certain box that came with them. The deposition of Alexander Ramsey, ex-governor of Minnesota, was then read. He knew William Wackerle in Minnesota, had only a moderate acquaintance with him. He was a stout man, and about 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a red complexion. The picture shown to him, Ramsey, differed from him entirely. He could trace no resemblance between it and the Wackerle he knew. Upon cross-examination he stated that he could not recollect exactly whether his hair was dark or not. Wackerle looked like a peasant from Europe. If a man cut his hair short, shaved clean, except a moustache, put on a clean shirt and good clothes, it is possible that after 14 years he would not be able to recollect him from his picture. Frederick H. Magdeburg's deposition was read. He said he knew Mrs. Walburga Wackerle at Milwaukee. He also knew William Wackerle in January 1867. During that month Wackerle made an application to him as agent of the Mutual Life for insurance upon his life, which was granted. The picture of William Wackerle, which had been shown him, is not the picture of the Wackerle whom he knew. He bore no resemblance to him. Mrs. Walburga Wackerle, the plaintiff, was recalled in rebuttal. She stated that she was married in Chaska in 1858. Her first child was named George William, and was born at Carver. The child died, and was buried in New Orleans. Her second child was born there. It was named George. It died when 2 weeks old, and was buried beside the other child. They went from New Orleans to Cincinnati. It was about 1860 when they went to Cincinnati. They lived there one summer. From there they went to the farm to Minnesota. One child, Emma Teresa, was born in the latter place. Also another child named John. He lived but 4 months. A girl named Joanna was born at Milwaukee. It lived 4 months. The next child was born at Milwaukee. It was named Otto, and lived 4 weeks. From there they went to Detroit. The next child was born in Quincy, Illinois. This was the last child she had, 7 in all. The farm was sold in 1865. They lived in Detroit about 1 year in 1868. From there they went to Chicago and to Cincinnati again. That was in 1869. The reason William Wackerle was re-examined at Cincinnati was that the premium was not paid in time, and the company would not accept it unless he was re-examined. They went back to Detroit, and from there her husband went to California. Her daughter was then living. She followed him to Sacramento, met him at Skimminger's. Her daughter lived about 8 months. About 2 months later they decided to move to Quincy. A zinc box was made by the undertaker to take Emma's body along. Her husband assisted in changing the body from one coffin to the zinc box. A wooden box was put around it. It was sent to Quincy by express. It did not get there until 2 days after they got there. When they arrived at Quincy she was sick. A policeman came to her and took her to a house where nobody lived. Her husband went for a woman to help her, but before he came back she gave birth to a child. Dr. Bassett came to see her that night. The child lived 8 months. The child that was born in Quincy was born before Emma was buried. They lived in Quincy until 1872. That year her husband went to California. She got a letter from him stating that he was going off to work. Upon cross-examination she stated that her memory was pretty good about some things, that she did not say to Mr. Weinmann that the man who came to her at Greiner's was not William Wackerle but John, that he looked more like Christopher than like William. She always lived happily with her husband. Her husband almost always wrote to her when he was away, telling her where he was. When he went south he wrote to her, but for some time she did not hear from him. When he wrote, he said he was going farther south. She wrote to John Wackerle at St. Louis, asking where her husband was. She was anxious about him. She knew John Wackerle. The man she saw in the courtroom did not look like John Wackerle. When her husband went to California he wrote to her. This closed the testimony in the case. Mr. Glover made the argument for the defence. He was followed by Mr. Donoghue for the plaintiff at about the same length. After the charge of Judge Treat, the jury retired and were out but a short time when they returned, and the foreman said: "We, the jury, find for the plaintiff, and assess the damages at $6,300 on the first count and $206.99 on the second. Mr. Shepley, the defendant's counsel, gave notice of an appeal. The case subsequently came up on appeal, and a new trial was denied. Judge Treat of the United States Circuit Court rendered the following opinion in the matter of a motion for a new trial: Walburga Wackerle versus Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York. A full examination has been made of the evidence, which was one peculiarly for the jury. It was on both sides full of doubt, inconsistencies, and contradictions. Turn as we may in the analysis of the evidence, strange and irreconcilable aspects are presented. The first point to be established by plaintiff was the death of her husband. That rested on the testimony of several witnesses concerning the railroad accident and the identity of the person killed thereby. The evidence of the plaintiff and others as to the skeleton exhumed some 4 or more years after such killing established to the satisfaction of the court that the exhumed skeleton was not that of the man killed, supposed to be William Wackerle, on December 25, 1872. The court directed the attention of the jury especially to that fact. Not that it was conclusive, but because it tended to show what weight should be given to the testimony. It may be that the exhumed skeleton was not that of William Wackerle, and hence the accuracy of plaintiff's testimony becomes questionable. Yet there was other evidence as to the death of the party killed, independent of the exhumation in 1877. It was therefore for the jury to decide whether, despite the mistakes as to the identity of the skeleton, William Wackerle was killed as alleged. The case, as presented by the evidence, was remarkable in many other respects, concerning which it is useless to comment. There are several depositions wanting, which the court has been anxious to read and analyse, but by some accident they have disappeared. Hence the court has to rely on its memory as to their contents, and if a new trial is granted, after a long lapse of time, to supply the same. So far as the court was justified in alluding to or commenting on the evidence, it pointed in its charges sharply against the plaintiff's claim, so far as the identity depended on the exhumed skeleton. Still the jury reached the conclusion that the plaintiff's husband was killed in 1872 as alleged, and consequently that the person produced by the defendant, and claiming to be William Wackerle, husband of the plaintiff, was not what he pretended. The case was tried at great length, and the largest scope given to a searching inquiry. Its novel aspects induced the court to admit every item of interest which could shed light on the subject. After full deliberation on the varied, inconsistent, and contradictory evidence, the jury reached a conclusion which was their exclusive province, and the court does not feel justified in interfering therewith. The motion for a new trial is overruled. While the company and William Wackerle came in for a large share of criticism and abuse at the hands of a portion of the press, it is but fair to publish a letter written to the San Francisco Bulletin, in which paper the letter was published, adding another chapter to this peculiar case. To the editor of the Bulletin: In the Weekly Bulletin of October 11, 1882, on the 4th page, appeared an article headed "A Question of Identity," wherein it is made to appear that I have lent myself to personate a dead man in order to assist the Aetna and the Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York to defraud a poor widow to receive an amount of $4,000 because of the death of her husband. I did not personate that husband as it is given out. I am, or rather have been, the husband of the indefatigable Mrs. Wackerle, the same who applied to the companies above named for an insurance on his life for the benefit of his wife. Heaven be praised, I am not that lady's husband any more, having long since been divorced, nor have I ever been that unlucky lover and unknown pedestrian who was run over by a railroad train in Texas in 1872, and furnished that lady a convenient corpse. The companies very properly refused to pay those policies on my life, because they always knew that I was not dead yet. And the Aetna Life Insurance Company was sustained in the refusal by the Supreme Court of the State of Louisiana, I having furnished abundant proof of my identity. Undismayed by this defeat, Mrs. Walburga Wackerle then tackled the Mutual Life Insurance Company and obtained a verdict in her favour before an accommodating jury, who were sufficiently softened by her tears to award her a handsome amount of money out of the pocket of a heartless corporation. This verdict ought to extinguish me, and I am truly sorry for the New York Sun, who, under date of October 18th, 1882, and the Humboldt Times, who on the 21st of the same month favoured me with such extended notices, that I am ill-mannered enough still to be among the living. The same William Wackerle who, in the year 1858, married Miss Walburga Schneider, lived with her to the month of June 1871, cohabited with her during that time, raising a family of children. I was born and baptized as William Wackerle, married as William Wackerle, got divorced as William Wackerle, and will always remain so, in spite of my wife's studied refusal to recognize me, and the sensational romances gotten up by the Sun newspaper, wherein I am made to figure as a double-dyed villain of the blackest hue, who aided and abetted the equally double-dyed villainous corporation named the Mutual Life Insurance Company of the City of New York. But the end is not yet, and before a higher tribunal the persecuted Walburga will be confronted by witnesses who know me from my earliest childhood, by witnesses from Eureka, Humboldt County, from Sacramento City, and other places where we have been living, and who will unmistakably establish the fact that they knew us both as man and wife. Then she will probably take another tramp to Texas and elsewhere to hunt up further testimony, for she is not the kind of woman who would willingly give up a large money stake. I do not deny that all the sensational stuff published has annoyed me. My acquaintance in a great many places of this state and Michigan and Illinois is large. My reputation has been good wherever I lived, and, valuing it more than anything else, I beg you would insert these lines at an early day, in order that all my friends and acquaintances, and the general public, may know that I denounce all infamous reports published against me as unmitigated lies, which it shall be my aim to unravel and lay barren, even if the reputation of Walburga Wackerle as a heroine should suffer thereby. I likewise wish everybody, and the above-named journals especially, to know that my hiding place is at a farm about 12 miles from Los Angeles City, in a district called the Azusa, which I acquired by dint of hard labour, and where I propose to live until I die for good and ever. November 6, 1882. William Wackerle. End of section 87. Section 88 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. An authentic record of remarkable cases. By John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. Problematic Cases, Part 10. The Maybrick Case. Few cases have attracted so much attention or attained so much notoriety as that of Mrs. Maybrick, both by reason of the persistent effort on the part of prominent American women to obtain her pardon and release, believing that she was unjustly accused and convicted of the murder of her husband, and also of the disputes in the English courts by leading members of the bar over the question of the liabilities of life insurance companies in respect to claims based upon deaths caused by murder. It is with more especial reference to the latter point that this case is introduced into this volume. If it be assumed that James Maybrick was poisoned, the inherent probabilities as to the motive point less strongly to the insurance on his life than to the woman's improper intimacy with another man. Mrs. Maybrick was the daughter of the late W.G. Chandler, a banker of Mobile, Alabama, and was educated in Germany and France. She met her future husband on an ocean steamer on the way to England in May 1880. He was a Liverpool cotton broker, and the acquaintance then formed ripened into marriage a year after. The couple first lived in Norfolk, Virginia, where Mr. Maybrick had business interests, but at the end of 2 years they went to Liverpool, their home being at Aberg, one of the suburbs. They lived happily together, according to all appearances, with the addition of a boy born in 1882 and a girl in 1886. The first quarrel that was known to have occurred followed their return from the Grand National races. In the course of a violent altercation that night, the servants heard Mr. Maybrick shout, "Such a scandal will be all over town to morrow." This outburst, presumably, had reference to her rash flirtations with her friend, Mr. Breeley. On or about October 3rd, 1888, James Maybrick effected an insurance upon his life with the Mutual Reserve Fund Life Association of New York, in the sum of £2,000, in favour of his wife, Florence Elizabeth Maybrick. On May 11th, 1889, James Maybrick died. A coroner's inquest was held, and the jury returned a verdict charging Mrs. Maybrick with causing his death. She was thereupon indicted for the murder of her husband by the administration of arsenic, and upon trial before Mr. Justice Stephen at the Liverpool Assizes, in August 1889, she was found guilty by the jury. On the 15th she was sentenced to be hanged, but the sentence was afterward commuted to penal servitude for life, the official record relating thereto being in the following terms: Her Majesty having been graciously pleased to extend her royal mercy to the said offender on condition that she be kept in penal servitude for the remainder of her natural life, and such condition of mercy having been signified to this court by the Right Honourable Henry Matthews, one of Her Majesty's principal Secretaries of State, this court hath allowed to the said offender the benefit of a conditional pardon, and it is therefore ordered that the said Florence Elizabeth Maybrick be kept in penal servitude for the remainder of her natural life. The cause of Mr. Maybrick's death was gastroenteritis, inflammation of the stomach and intestines, which the doctors declared had been induced by some irritant poison. After the arrest of Mrs. Maybrick, the house was searched, and 85 grains of arsenic were found. The post mortem examination revealed no arsenic in the stomach, but a fraction of a grain was found in the liver. The trial, which lasted 6 days, was largely a battle of experts. Doctors Carter, Humphreys, and Stevenson stoutly maintaining that death was due to arsenical poisoning, while Doctors Tidy, McNamara, Barron, and Professor Paul contesting that view. It was proved on the trial that Maybrick had purchased 150 grains of arsenic 3 months before his death, and it was also shown that he was greatly addicted to dosing himself with drugs, and that arsenic in minute quantities was one of his favourite remedies. The charge of Justice Stephen to the jury was so unjudicial, so one-sided, and so condemnatory of the prisoner that, though the jury brought in a verdict of guilty in 38 minutes, a revulsion of feeling in her favour followed among the people, which was reflected in the press. Sir Charles Russell protested against it to the Home Secretary in forcible terms, and even the counsel for the Crown, Mr. Addison, said that the verdict was not warranted by the evidence. Soon afterward Stephen was compelled by insanity to retire from the bench, and his death followed. By the will of James Maybrick, dated April 25th, 1889, Thomas Maybrick and Michael Maybrick were appointed his executors. On or about August 1st, 1889, Mrs. Maybrick assigned the life insurance policy and all her interests thereunder to Richard Stuart Cleaver. The assignment was by deed, and notice thereof was duly given to the Mutual Reserve Fund. On August 30, 1889, Cleaver was appointed administrator of the property and effects of Florence Elizabeth Maybrick. Subsequently, when a claim was made for the amount of the policy, the association refused to pay. The managers had advanced £200, in view of the impoverished condition of Mrs. Maybrick, and in response to her urgent petition to meet the expenses of her defence at the Liverpool Assizes, but the payment was upon the express condition that it should be without prejudice to any question that might arise in regard to the policy, or to the liability of the defendant company thereunder. Suit was brought by the plaintiff Cleaver, as assignee and administrator, or in the alternative the plaintiffs Thomas and Michael Maybrick as executors, for recovery of £1,800, the balance of the amount of the policy. The issues of law arising in the action were argued in the Queen's Bench Division of the High Court of Justice July 13th, 1891, and concluded July 20th. The questions of law for the opinion of the court were stated as follows. 1. Whether, if it be proved that the said James Maybrick died from poison intentionally administered to him by the said Florence Elizabeth Maybrick, that would afford a defence to this action, A. As against the plaintiff, Richard Stewart Cleaver, as assignee of the policy from Florence Elizabeth Maybrick, assuming the assignment to be proved. B. As against the plaintiff Cleaver as administrator, under the statute 33 and 34 Vic. Chapter 23, Section 9. C. As against the plaintiffs Thomas and Michael Maybrick as executors of James Maybrick, deceased. 2. Whether, if the conviction of the said Florence Elizabeth Maybrick, alleged in the statement of defence, be proved in this action, such conviction will be A. Conclusive of her guilt, and an answer to this action as against any or either and which of the plaintiffs. B. Admissible in evidence in this action. 3. Whether either the commutation of the sentence stated in the plaintiff's reply on the grounds there set forth, or the conditional pardon on the grounds stated in the defendant's rejoinder, will, if proved, afford an answer to the alleged conviction. The court records show that as a curiosity of legal pleading, the ingenious effort of Sir Charles Russell, the eminent counsel for the plaintiffs, and now Lord Chief Justice of England, took high rank. He admitted that Florence Maybrick herself had no right to benefit by her crime, a claim for her right to recover would be simply monstrous, but he contended that even if it were admitted that James Maybrick died from poison intentionally administered by his wife, and that she had no remedy, the question at issue was whether the plaintiffs, the assignee Cleaver, or the executors Thomas and Michael Maybrick, who under the Married Women's Property Act of 1882 were trustees of Mrs. Maybrick, could recover. But the Felonies Act and the principles of public policy were too strong even for the argumentative force of Sir Charles Russell. Nothing can be clearer than that it would be against public morals and the established policy of law for a murderer to profit by his own crime. If, therefore, there was a fatal objection to a suit on the part of the woman herself to recover the amount of insurance on her husband's life, the objection applied with equal force to a suit on the part of her legal representatives. They are in no better position, in point of fact, than the woman herself. The Queen's Bench Division, Mr. Justice Denman and Mr. Justice Wills, held that, the action being for the benefit of Mrs. Maybrick, it was against public policy that such an action should be allowed. The plaintiffs appealed. On the 8th of December 1891 the case came up on appeal from the decision of the Queen's Bench, before the Court of Appeal, the Master of the Rolls and Lords Justices Fry and Lopes. This court, in pronouncing judgment, drew a sharp line of distinction between the two plaintiff contestants, the administrator and the executors. The Master of the Rolls gave a lengthy opinion concluding as follows: Section 11 of the Married Women's Property Act, 1882, creates a trust in favour of the wife. The section provides that so long as any object of the trust remains unperformed, the money is not to form part of the insured's estate. Therefore it results from that if the object of the trust is performed, the money forms part of the insured's estate. No trustee was appointed, therefore under that section the executors were the trustees of the policy for the purposes aforesaid, that is, for the wife, so long as any object of the trust remains unperformed, and when the trust is performed, the money is to form part of the estate. If the wife were to die during the lifetime of her husband, no one could contend that the insurance company could refuse to receive any money premiums and refuse to go on with the contract. I take it that, upon a fair reading of Section 2, if the object of the trust has become impossible, it is right to say that the object of the trust is so far performed. That being so, and the section being subject to the rule of public policy, Mrs. Maybrick has rendered the trust incapable of being performed. She must be treated as struck out of the trust must be treated as performed. The rule of public policy must not be carried further than is necessary. That rule is not necessary as between the executors and the defendants. When the money is in the hands of the executors, they hold it for the wife, but the trust is gone, they are then trustees of the estate. The creditors, if any, of the husband will get paid out of it, and then it will go on to his children. The children do not claim through the wife, but through the father, and there is nothing in public policy to prevent this. If the rule of public policy applied to such a case, it would create a grievous injustice. Anyone claiming through the wife is shut out, therefore her assignee and any creditors of hers are shut out, but the rule does not apply as between executors of the husband and the defendants. There is, therefore, no defence to this action as against the claim of the executors, and judgment must be entered for them. Plaintiff who claims through the wife must fail. The Lords Justices concurred in this view, Lord Justice Fry closing his opinion in the following terms: "If the executors are not trustees for Florence Maybrick, for whom are they trustees? This question seems to admit of an easy answer. Whenever there is property produced by the payment of A which is held in trust for B, and that trust fails or is satisfied, a resulting trust arises for A or his estate. This resulting trust is recognized by the section of the Act in question, because it takes the property out of the estate of the insured so long as any object of the trust remains unperformed, language which implies, if it does not assert, that when no object of the trust remains to be performed, the policy moneys form part of the estate of the insured. If it be suggested that this view only removes the difficulty a step further off, and that the possible right of the wife under her husband's will or intestacy forms an objection to the action by the executors, the reply is obvious, that the principle of public policy must be applied as often as any claim is made by the murderess, and will always form an effectual bar to any benefit which she may seek to acquire as the result of her crime. It follows from the view which I have expressed, that I think it needless to inquire into what the particular trusts on which the administrator of the convict's property appointed under the statute of 1870 may be. He took only the property which Florence Maybrick had in the moneys in question, and as she took nothing, in my judgment, by reason of her crime, he takes nothing likewise. It may be argued that having regard to the fact that Mrs. Maybrick is the prime object of the insurance, and that she is named on the face of the policy as payee, the contract of insurance must be taken to imply as exception of the case of the death of the insured when caused by the crime of the person so named; and it is suggested that Fauntleroy's case in the House of Lords supports this contention. This argument does not appear to me as tenable. The policy is effected under, and therefore affected by, a statutory enactment, the effect of which, in the present case, is to vest the policy in the executors of the insured as trustees in the event of Mrs. Maybrick's being entitled to claim in trust for her, and in every other event in trust for the estate of James Maybrick, just in the same way as if before the statute a policy had been taken out by James Maybrick, and he had by a separate instrument declared the like trusts of it. Now it is to my mind illogical to make the crime of one cestuique trust a bar to the claim of another, or of the trustees for that other cestuique trust, and if the supposed defence were to prevail, we should so hold. If Mrs. Maybrick had inflicted a mortal but not immediately fatal wound on her husband, had then committed suicide, leaving him surviving, and his executors had claimed on his death, it appears to me that the crime which caused his death would have furnished no defence. In a word, I think that the rule of public policy should be applied so as to exclude from benefit the criminal and all claiming under her, but not as to exclude alternative or independent rights. In Fauntleroy's case, the plaintiffs were the assigns of the criminal and were claiming through him. In the present case, the plaintiffs are the assigns in law of the innocent husband, and are claiming through him. The authority, therefore, of that case goes to show that neither Florence Maybrick nor the administrator of her estate, who claims through her, can take any benefit. But that appears to me to throw no impediment in the way of a suit by those who claim with clean hands themselves and as assigns of the innocent insured. In a word, it appears to me that the crime of one person may prevent that person from the assertion of what would otherwise be a right, and may accelerate or beneficially affect the rights of third persons, but can never prejudice or injuriously affect those rights. In my opinion, therefore, public policy prevents Florence Maybrick from asserting any title as cestuique trust of this fund, and thereby brings into operation the resulting trust in favour of the estate of the insured, and so enables the executors to maintain an action as plaintiffs without any taint derived from the crime committed by Florence Maybrick. The Mutual Reserve Fund Association was strongly advised to appeal from this adverse decision to the House of Lords, but meanwhile a new complication arose, and the management resolved to make no further contest. Informal notice was given that the Crown would claim the proceeds of the policy, technical difficulty having been discovered in the reasonings from which the foregoing quotations have been taken. After the decision of the Court of Appeal as to the liability of the executors of the estate of James Maybrick, the association was ready to comply with the ruling, but on finding that Mr. Cleaver would not waive his claim, and that the Crown was not likely to waive its rights, the full amount of the claim on the policy was paid into court for final adjudication. Whether Mrs. Maybrick poisoned her husband with criminal intent is a question which can only be answered by the inmate of the Woking prison herself. End of section 88.
Section 89 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BrandonB. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. An authentic record of remarkable cases. By John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. The Austin Disappearance. Mr. John C. Austin, or Jack Austin, as he was familiarly known to many people in New York and Brooklyn, was a member of the firm of shipbrokers Lord and Austin, whose office was at number 18 Broadway. He was well known as an athlete and devotee of field sports, and was one of the original incorporators of the Williamsburg Athletic Club. Up to the time of his disappearance, he was considered a man of comfortable means, but not wealthy. His home was at number 1114 Dean Street, Brooklyn, where his family consisted of 3 young children, his wife having died in February 1891. He bore an excellent reputation, and before going into business on his own account had been in the employ of Mallory and Company. His firm was largely engaged in the business of charters to Haiti and other West Indian islands, and was supposed to be prosperous. Austin left his home shortly after noon on July 4th, 1893, saying that he thought of going to the races, but he might change his mind and decide to take a bath at Manhattan Beach. He kissed his 3 children when he went out, and when they cried at not being allowed to accompany him, he comforted them with the promise that he would be back to dinner, and would take them to see the fireworks in the evening. From that moment there is no record that anyone ever saw John C. Austin alive again, although after the news of the drowning, a barber at Nostrand Avenue, near Fulton Street, who had a very slight acquaintance with Austin, said that he thought he had come to his shop to be shaved shortly after noon. That afternoon, as nearly as can be calculated, in the vicinity of 4 o'clock, a man hired room number 391 in the bathing pavilion at Manhattan Beach. He placed his valuables in one of the envelopes provided for the purpose, and wrote across it in lead pencil, John C. Austin, 1114 Dean Street, Brooklyn. That bit of writing afterward constituted one of the strongest points of evidence for the plaintiffs in a suit in court in the following January. The envelope was placed in the safe, and a check, number 272, was handed to the man. It was nearly 9 o'clock that night, and the last bathers had long departed, when the clerk in charge of the office, in going through the contents of the safe, found the envelope bearing Austin's name and address. The bathroom was immediately searched, and in it were found a blue serge coat and vest, and grey trousers, somewhat worse for wear, a blue striped outing shirt, white underclothing, and a derby hat of a rather peculiar shape. In the pockets were a card case, containing cards bearing Austin's name and address, a penknife, a bunch of keys, and some lead pencils. Ernest L. Schumann, superintendent of the bathing pavilion, opened the envelope left in the office, in the presence of Captain Hotchkiss of the Manhattan Beach Police, John J. Rothwell, the clerk, and fireman Peter R. Mullins. It was found to contain a lady's gold watch and chain, studded with pearls, a seal ring bearing the initial S, a pocketbook containing $3, and a coin purse with $1.05 in small change. The finding of the clothing and valuables was accepted as certain evidence that the owner had been drowned while bathing, and a dispatch was sent at once to Austin's home in Brooklyn. His brother, Joseph E. Austin, and his brother-in-law, Thomas C. Carruthers, hastened to the beach and fully identified the effects as those of Austin. A search for the body was begun, and for 2 days following a constant patrol was kept on the beach by the police and volunteer searchers. Every foot of the beach and the adjacent shores of Sheepshead Bay, Jamaica Bay, Plum Island, and Rockaway were searched in vain. That the body of a man drowned at Coney Island should not be cast ashore somewhere inside of Sandy Hook was something unprecedented in the recollection of the oldest beachmen, and by degrees faint suspicions began to be entertained. Those who still clung firmly to the drowning theory pointed out that the body, after coming to the surface, had been driven out seaward by the strong northwesterly winds that had prevailed for some days. At this the old-timers shook their heads in doubt. It was about 4 o'clock, they argued, when the bathroom was hired, and the flood tide was setting strongly for several hours afterward, which could hardly have failed to cast the body ashore long before the ebb set in. It was absurd, they pointed out, to suppose that the man could have remained swimming until the end of the flood. Even if he had done so, the body would have come to the surface within a week, and experience showed that the full flood would have carried it shoreward. Little by little, other suspicious features of the case began to crop out. There was but one ring found in the envelope, the seal one, which was of little value, while it was known that Austin always wore a ring set with a fine brilliant. It was naturally asked why he did not place it also in the security of the safe. His friends explained it by saying that the diamond ring was fitted so closely that it could only be removed with difficulty, but several persons recalled having seen Austin take off the ring to allow the beauty of the diamond to be examined. Still another point to which significance was attached was the finding of the lady's watch, which had belonged to Austin's wife and which he had never before been known to wear. Inquiry led to the discovery that he had carried it for several days, while his own watch, a magnificent chronometer, had been under repair in Benedict's in Broadway. Inquiry at Benedict's resulted in the discovery that the watch had been returned on July 3rd, the very day before Austin's disappearance. This threw still more doubt on the case, particularly when it was learned that Austin had not called for the watch himself, but sent a messenger boy with a check for $8, the amount of the bill for repairs. Why he should have trusted such a valuable instrument to a messenger boy, when his office was within a stone's throw of the jeweler's, and why he should have continued to wear his wife's watch, was considered peculiar. No trace of the watch has ever been found. Still another circumstance added to the sum of suspicion. Austin was a frequent patron at Manhattan Beach Bathing Pavilion, and was well known by sight by most of the employees, and yet not one of them could remember having seen him on the day in question. What made this the more remarkable was the fact that, as the air was chilly and a rather disagreeable wind was blowing, there were comparatively few attendees at the baths that day. In all, not more than 600, when on warm days the crowd might be counted by as many as thousands. A photograph of the missing man, which was shown to all the employees of the pavilion, was recognized by none of them as that of a man whom they had seen that day. Then there was the question of clothing, which, while it had undoubtedly belonged to Austin, was not such as he would have been likely to wear on a holiday. It was well worn, and while it might have served for rough-outing purposes, was by no means like Austin's usual attire. The small amount of money found was also surprising, and Mr. Lord, Austin's partner, called to attention the fact that the missing man always carried a considerable sum about him, and that he had never known him to be without at least $100. A man named Joseph A. Dallin, who was said to be an Englishman on a visit to this country, made an affidavit long afterward that he had seen a man drowned in front of the pavilion on the afternoon of July 4th. According to Dallin's story, he was watching the bathers when his attention was attracted to a swimmer who was about 50 yards outside the life raft, who seemed to be half swimming, half floating on his back, and slowly approaching the raft, as if drifting on the tide. When the swimmer was within 100 feet or so of the raft, he suddenly turned over on his face and sunk. Dallin was sufficiently interested to examine the raft next day through an opera glass to discern if there was any aperture through which the swimmer might have come to the surface. But he seems to have been in no hurry to communicate either to the police or anyone else what he had seen. The cloud of suspicion, however, would have speedily blown away, and Austin would have been accepted as definitely dead, had it not turned out that his life was insured in 2 companies, both of which promptly refused to accept the evidence of his death. One of the policies, for $15,000, had been issued by the Mutual Reserved Fund Life Association in 1885, payable to Austin's estate. The other was insured by the United States Mutual Accident Association on July 1st, 3 days before Austin's disappearance. Austin visited the company's office that day and obtained the insurance on his personal application. He represented himself as a man who traveled a great deal, and said that he was in excellent physical health. It was recalled afterward that he demurred somewhat at paying the membership fee of $10, that he went out as if dissatisfied, and then returned and finally concluded the bargain, after getting a rebate on the premium. He asked the secretary particularly whether the policy would go into effect from that very moment, and asked that it be mailed to him without delay. The policy was accordingly mailed to him that afternoon. From the time that Joseph E. Austin, the executor of his brother's will, made his demand on both companies, detectives scoured this country and Canada in search of the man who, they were firmly convinced, was in hiding. Although his whereabouts could not be definitely determined, it was believed that at the approaching trial evidence would be submitted to show that several persons had seen and conversed with Austin at Shrewsbury River and other places after his disappearance. There was reason to believe that the missing man found a secure retreat in the fastness of the Adirondack wilderness, from which, in various disguises, he made occasional trips to visit his children, who are being educated in Canada. Mr. F. A. Burnham, then counsel, now president of the Mutual Reserve Fund, said, "There is no doubt that Austin is alive and in hiding, and that his disappearance was simply a carefully concocted scheme to defraud this company. It is quite possible that Austin never went near Manhattan Beach, and that the jewelry and valuables were placed in the bathhouse by a confederate." "Here," said Mr. Burnham, "is his picture as he was more than a year after his disappearance." The portrait represents a tall-statured man in a hunting costume and Winchester in hand, standing in front of a rough hunting lodge. It had evidently been cut from a group, for one side is a portion of a companion's figure, similarly clad in a coutred. When asked where he had obtained the picture, Mr. Burnham smiled and said, "I'm not quite prepared to tell you how we got it or where it was taken. Mind, I don't say it was in the Adirondacks, but everyone knows what a famous hiding place those trackless woods would make for a man who wanted to disappear utterly from the world. When he disappeared, we tried to get from his family a picture, which we would have sent broadcast over the entire country, but they declared that they had nothing but an old tintype." Austin's will, dated January 28, 1885, leaving all his property to his children, was admitted to probate, without opposition, on September 21, 1891. Shortly afterward, the 3 children were taken to Canada, where they are living with their relatives. Mr. Ettlinger, manager of the Death Claim Department of the United States Mutual Accident Association, said, "We have made some investigation, and were satisfied long ago that Austin was alive. I don't think there is any doubt about it. As far as this company is concerned, however, it doesn't make a great deal of difference whether he is alive or dead. Our policy was an accident one, and in view of the circumstances of his alleged death, admitting that it took place, it is obviously impossible to determine whether it was accidental or suicidal. I fail to see how any claim can be made on us." Joseph F. Austin was firmly convinced that his brother was drowned and that his body was swept out to sea. He said that his brother had no conceivable motive for disappearing, and that his character forbade the presumption that he would attempt to defraud anyone. While he was not rich, he had means sufficient for his wants, and his business was in a prosperous condition. Mr. Austin thought that the picture in the possession of the insurance company was taken years ago, while his brother was on a hunting trip in the woods. The Mutual Reserve Fund Life Association, having refused to pay a claim to the beneficiaries of a man whose death was not proved, and who was, with good reason, believed to be alive, suit was brought for recovery. The trial came on in the Supreme Court of the City of New York, January 2, 1894, and terminated on the 16th of the same month, with a verdict for the plaintiff for the full amount of the policies, $15,000. The result was anticipated as soon as it became apparent that the court would be likely to submit the case to a jury for determination. The only expectation of winning the case was founded upon the opinion that no proof was submitted to the jury on behalf of the plaintiff tending to show that Austin was dead, and in that opinion, as matter of law, the counsel of the association is as confirmed today as ever. After the verdict was rendered, the association would not authorize an appeal, but directed payment of the full amount of the claim, basing action upon the idea that the verdict was a justification for the payment of the claim, such a payment being without warrant or authority independently of such verdict. At the same time, there is not the slightest doubt on the part of the men of trained observation that John C. Austin did not die by drowning at Manhattan Beach on the 4th of July, 1891, the date of his alleged death, and it will not be surprising if detective skill will yet be able to produce him alive and well, in view of evidence in possession of the law department of the association. End of section 89.
Section 90 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BettyB. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies. An Authentic Record of Remarkable Cases by John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. Problematical Cases, Part 12. A Question of Identity, Mistaken Identity. The embarrassment which is sometimes occasioned by disputed identification may be illustrated by a resume of a curious and puzzling case in the Western States. A policy written by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company on the life of Marcus L. Johnson in the sum of $2,000 for the benefit of his wife, Rhoda Johnson, became a claim by reason of the death of the insured, which occurred in May 1869. The amount was duly paid by the company to one George E. Johnson of Leavenworth, Kansas, a brother of the deceased, who was empowered by the beneficiary to receive the money, surrender the policy, and grant the company a legal discharge. The widow, Mrs. Rhoda Johnson, resided in Cincinnati, Ohio. Mr. George E. Johnson, having advanced a sum of money to the widow prior to obtaining the amount due from the company, on receiving the money, made up a package enclosing the balance due her, amounting to $748.91, and shipped the same by the United States Express Company from the office in Leavenworth addressed to Mrs. Rhoda Johnson, Cincinnati. Accompanying the package was a note addressed to the Cincinnati agent of the Express Company, requesting him to give personal attention to the matter and see that Mrs. Rhoda Johnson received the money and receipted for it with her own hand. As Mrs. Johnson was unknown to the Cincinnati agent, he addressed her a line through the post office requesting her to call at the express office and receive her insurance money. In response to this notice, she called and claimed the money, bringing with her, for the purpose of identification, letters written to her by George E. Johnson, her brother-in-law, and also a letter from the Express Company's agent in Leavenworth. The intelligent, straightforward, businesslike manner of Mrs. Johnson seemed sufficiently conclusive of her honesty, and the express agent did not doubt that she was the person for whom the money was intended. But, as personal identification had been enjoined upon him, he required her to produce someone known to himself who could vouch for her. This she was able to do, and she soon returned with the local agent of the insurance company who had previously paid to her the sum of $200 which had been sent to his care for her by George E. Johnson of Leavenworth. The sum thus sent was by draft upon the First National Bank of Cincinnati, payable to the order of Mrs. Rhoda Johnson, and the insurance agent having identified Mrs. Johnson at that time, she received the money from the bank. This was deemed sufficient. The package of money was accordingly delivered to Mrs. Johnson, for which she gave her receipt and then went her way. She had not been gone long when Major C. H. Blackburn, prosecuting attorney for Hamilton County and a lawyer of eminence and ability, called at the office of the Express Company, where he made inquiry for a package of money purporting to contain $748.91 and addressed to Mrs. Rhoda Johnson. He was told that the package had been received and delivered to Mrs. Johnson. Major Blackburn manifested surprise at this, as Mrs. Rhoda Johnson was his client who several weeks ago had placed in his hands for collection from George E. Johnson of Leavenworth, Kansas, a claim for the balance due under an insurance policy, and he had been in correspondence with Mr. Johnson and also with the home office of the insurance company in Milwaukee. A few days previously, he had received by mail a duplicate of the receipt given by the Express Company for the package addressed to Mrs. Rhoda Johnson and said to contain $748.91. This led him to inquire at the Express office as stated. Major Blackburn again visited the Express office, bringing with him his client, to learn, as he stated, whether she was the woman to whom the package had been delivered, as he feared that she was practicing some deception upon him in saying she had not received it. He was at once told that she was not the person. Major Blackburn was preparing to vouch for his client as being Mrs. Rhoda Johnson, the person for whom the package was intended. She had been introduced to him by respectable people whom he knew and with whom she was well acquainted. His knowledge of her satisfied him that she was not capable of concocting any swindle upon the insurance or the express company, and he was certain that she had no backers, aiders, or abettors in such a scheme. This woman evidently was a weak-minded person, ignorant and apparently poor, being shabbily dressed. She spoke English with a German accent, and in every respect contrasted broadly with the Mrs. Rhoda Johnson who had called for and received the money. The story of Mrs. Rhoda No. 2 was in substance that she was the wife and now the widow of Marcus L. Johnson, upon whose life she had held an insurance policy in the sum of $2,000, written by the Northwestern Mutual, and that she had sent the policy to her brother-in-law, Mr. George E. Johnson of Leavenworth, Kansas, for collection. He had sent to her, and she had received from him, $200 on account, but in default of payment of the balance due her, she had placed her claim in the hands of Major Blackburn. She exhibited letters which she had in her possession from Mr. George E. Johnson. One of these letters was of sympathy and condolence, and mentioned having previously sent $200. She also showed a letter from the Leavenworth agent of the express company, the substance of which was that he wanted to be sure of her receipt of the money. Notwithstanding the confidence of Major Blackburn in the honesty and justice of his client's cause, the Cincinnati agent of the express company felt that Mrs. Rhoda No. 1, to whom he had paid the money, was the legitimate claimant, and that Mrs. Rhoda No. 2 was a fraud. But he at once perceived that the circumstances demanded explanation, and he therefore called upon the insurance agent who had identified Mrs. Rhoda No. 1 and requested him to produce the lady. She was readily found and brought to the express office and confronted with Mrs. Rhoda No. 2. The two were questioned and cross-examined, and their examination elicited the following information. Mrs. Rhoda Johnson No. 1 had been married by Bishop Simpson to Marcus L. Johnson 17 years ago and had had 8 children, 7 of whom were living. Her husband was a bookbinder and blank book manufacturer and had been established in business in Evansville, Indiana, and Topeka, Kansas. From the latter place he came with his family to Cincinnati, where he remained until his death. When he left Topeka, he was suffering from a cancerous affection of his stomach, of which he died more than a year afterward. Mrs. Rhoda No. 2 was married 8 years ago near New York City by a magistrate, and had 2 children by her husband, whose name was Marcus L. Johnson. They had lived together for years in New York and Cincinnati. No. 1 never had been absent from her husband beyond a few weeks at a time. No. 2 said her husband was a bookbinder by trade, had suffered 4 years from cancer of the stomach, of which disease he died and was buried in Cincinnati. Both had had the insurance policy of $2,000 on the life of Marcus L. Johnson, and both had sent it to George E. Johnson to collect. They both knew George E. Johnson of Leavenworth. He had visited at both their houses in Cincinnati, and both claimed him as their brother-in-law. No. 1 explained an agreement between the 2 brothers, Marcus L. and George E., relating to the insurance. It was that as Marcus was unable to continue the payment of premiums, George E. was to do so, and for this was to receive 1/2 the avails of the policy for his advance and trouble. In conformity with this agreement, George E. had sent her this package containing $748.91, which was the balance due to her after deducting George E. Johnson's share of $1,000, the $200 advanced to her soon after her husband's death, and a premium note of Marcus L. Johnson for $49 and $2.09 accrued interest. No. 2 claimed to have received $200 from George E. Johnson, it having been advanced by him to her as a portion of the insurance money. She produced letters from George E. Johnson and a letter from Mr. Somerville, the Leavenworth agent of the insurance company, who was also agent of the express company, which seemed to support her claim. The women were questioned separately and apart, and each adhered to her story without variation or contradiction. No. 1 offered to produce the photograph of her husband, so accompanied by the sheriff, she went to her house and soon returned with the likeness of Marcus L. Johnson. This picture being shown to number 2, she at once declared it to be a likeness of her husband, and she then produced a photograph of a child 4 to 5 years of age, which she said was a picture of her son, and in which her attorney saw a strong resemblance to the photographed face of Marcus L. Johnson. As both parties claimed George E. Johnson as their brother-in-law, both knew him, and he had visited each of them at their houses, it was suggested that the photographs of the 2 women should be taken and sent to the superintendent of the express company at Leavenworth, who was to be requested to see George E. Johnson and ascertain if his brother had 2 wives, and if not, which of these women was his wife. Acting upon this suggestion, their photographs were at once secured, both readily consenting, and were sent as indicated, together with full particulars of the facts in the case. Pending the transmission of these photographs and the report therefrom, the Cincinnati agent of the express company determined to pursue the investigation still further. His opinion had not changed from the first, being fully convinced that Mrs. Rhoda Johnson, who received the money, was the only wife of Marcus L. Johnson, and that the other woman was an impostor. The result of his investigation, as recounted by himself, was published in the Cincinnati newspapers of the day. In the course of his account, he said, "Taking with me a detective officer, we went in search of the woman who made the claim on the express company, and found her acting as cook in a low den of prostitution. I took down her statements very fully in writing, questioning and cross-questioning her. I found her memory very defective as to dates and several material facts. My examination was more thorough than at any other time. She claims to have had 2 children, one dead and the other in Indiana, she don't know where. Her whole statement bears on its face an attempt to swindle, concocted by other parties, and I believe this woman has imposed upon Major Blackburn, who undertook her case, not knowing all the facts. This woman has obtained from the post office quite a number of letters belonging to Mrs. Rhoda Johnson, and admitted to me that she did not know whether they belonged to herself or not." 2 days after the publication of these facts, Major Blackburn informed a newspaper reporter, upon reading the card of the express company's agent in relation to the case, he sent an officer for his client and had her brought to his office. That he then told her plainly that there could be no more lying about the matter, she having shown herself to be an impostor. He should insist on her telling him the truth of the matter and confessing who had instigated the false statements she had given. That she then fully acknowledged her guilty conduct, admitted she never had been married to Marcus L. Johnson, nor had ever seen him or his brother, George E. Johnson, that her name was Rhoda Berry, and a man named John Johnson had put her up to getting the letters from the post office advertised for Rhoda Johnson, and these letters she had obtained and shown to him, that all she knew of the insurance or of the parties interested she obtained from these letters. About the same time Mrs. Rhoda Johnson received from Major Blackburn the following letter: Office of Prosecuting Attorney, Hamilton County, Cincinnati, January 20th, 1870. Mrs. Rhoda Johnson, Madam, a thorough investigation of the matter which we have been looking after for some days has satisfied me that you are the legitimate wife of Marcus L. Johnson, that the other woman who claimed to be his wife is an impostor and scoundrel, and that her conduct in the case has done you great and unmerited injustice. I cheerfully make this statement, not because she has basely wronged you by her conduct and declarations, but because she has so basely imposed upon my confidence by falsehood and fraud. Very respectfully, C. H. Blackburn. Mistaken identity. A remarkable instance of mistaken identity occurred at Tacoma, State of Washington, in 1889. On the 20th of May in that year, John M. Poyne, a Cincinnati detective, swore out a warrant for the arrest of W. A. Hedden of Tacoma, charging him with having defrauded life insurance companies to the extent of $14,000. Bail was fixed at $10,000, and, at the request of the detective, Examination was deferred for 2 weeks in order that additional evidence might be obtained from Buffalo, New York, where the frauds were alleged to have been committed. Hedden could not give bonds and was placed in jail, where he remained until failure to identify him as the real offender led to his release. Strange to say, he was taken for Bryant A. Crandall, who in 1886 lived in Buffalo and had insurance on his life for $14,000. He started for the West, and in April it was reported that he had committed suicide. The facts concerning the alleged suicide were such that the companies concerned paid the full amount of the insurance to the supposed dead man's relatives. In the fall of 1887, Crandall was seen in Los Angeles, California, by a prominent citizen of Buffalo. The latter reported the fact to the insurance companies. They combined and offered a reward of $2,000 for the arrest of Crandall. Detectives immediately began to hunt for him. Poyne in some way learned that Crandall had been in Tacoma several months. On arrival, he saw Hedden, who resembled Crandall in a remarkable degree, became acquainted with him, and went into partnership with him in a land locating agency, doing business all over the Sound country. His height, color of eyes, beard, size, and weight exactly coincided with Crandall's. On the latter's right foot was a scar over 4 inches in length, the result of a wound accidentally inflicted upon himself with an axe when a young man. In order to find whether Hedden had such a scar, Poyne proposed they should rent a furnished room together, and Hedden accepted the proposition. That night, when Hedden disrobed, the detective watched his roommate slowly pull off his socks, and strangely enough, there was a scar. The next day Poyne got out his warrant for Hedden and was sure of his man. After he was lodged in jail, more positive evidence was needed from Buffalo, and daily the wires were used in securing it. Hedden's photograph was taken and sent to Buffalo, and word came back that it was the picture of Crandall. Hedden persistently asserted his innocence, declared that he owned a farm at Lakeview near Rochester on which his family were living, and that he had gone to the far West like a good many others to make money. President Fitch of the Traders' Bank of Tacoma, formerly of Rochester, became interested in Hedden. Mr. Bach, a merchant of Buffalo who knew Crandall, happened to arrive in Tacoma on business. At the request of Mr. Fitch, he went to the jail to see Hedden, and said, though Hedden resembled Crandall in a remarkable degree, he was not Crandall. Mr. Bach swore to his evidence, but the detective was not satisfied. The latter telegraphed to the chief of police of Buffalo, asking if Bach's word could be believed. The answer came back that his evidence could not well be disputed. This settled the matter in the minds of Hedden's friends. The same afternoon, the counsel on both sides closely questioned Hedden, asking him 50 or more questions. They then telegraphed to the postmaster at Lakeview, Hedden's alleged home, and asked him to reply to the very same questions they had put to Hedden while the prisoner and his counsel, the detective and his counsel, were all in the courtroom. When the reply from the Lakeview postmaster was received, his answer to each question exactly corroborated the statements made by Hedden, and when the long telegram was finished, Mr. Poyne, the detective, and his counsel gave up the case, and acknowledged that Hedden was not the long-lost Crandall. The sequel came in June 1892, when the real offender was captured in Los Angeles. He made a confession to his counsel in which he acknowledged that he was Bryant A. Crandall. Afterward, he admitted his identity and his guilt to a representative of a press association. He recited the particulars of his disappearance from his home in Buffalo, and then said, "After leaving my hat on the park bench at Niagara Falls, I boarded a train and went to California. 2 months afterward, I was surprised and amused one day to learn that my dead body had been found at the falls. All this time I was sawing wood, as they say. I was, literally, too. I went directly to California and hired out as a carpenter. I knew the trade well. I had none of the old disappointments out there, no worry, no creditors, and no more trials. I had a very easy time. Then I got tired of carpentering and went to running a stationary engine. I was successful at that too. I met Buffalo people quite frequently, but I had changed so much that I did not think they would know me. My hair and beard had turned very gray. I lost considerable flesh, and my liver trouble made me walk lame. I was somehow betrayed and delivered into the hands of the police. When I met my brother on Sunday, I told him who I was, but he did not identify me positively. He thought I was Crandall, but was not sure. His manner, while in jail awaiting trial, was that of a man who plumed himself on having done a clever thing. He expressed willingness to return to his wife and family if they would receive him, but exhibited no sign of remorse for his desertion of them. End of section 90.
Section 91 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Hampton. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies, an authentic record of remarkable cases, by John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. Section 91. Self-Mutilation in Accident Insurance, Part 1. To the superficial observer, it may seem incredible that intentional, self-inflicted wounds, causing mutilation of the person or serious disablement, should ever occur. The old Army surgeon, however, will recall many an instance where, for the purpose of obtaining a furlough or a discharge from service, such maiming has been practiced. The writer has in mind a case which occurred in the early part of our late war, where a soldier, a Bohemian, having feigned epilepsy without success, shot off his index or trigger finger, hoping thereby to obtain his discharge. He claimed that the injury was purely accidental, and it having been proven intentional, he then shot himself dead. So far from being uncommon or of recent occurrence, we have only to recall the fact that in the days of the Roman Empire, the cutting off of one's thumb was practiced to an alarming extent by those who were forced into the military service, and hence we have the term poltroon, which is derived from Pollux truncatus. It then becomes, in civil as well as in military life, simply a question of motive. Not a few instances have occurred where self-inflicted wounds by defaulters have been produced with the intention of simulating an assault by robbers, thereby hoping to divert suspicion from the real thief. Sometimes the mere love of notoriety has been a sufficient motive. In all such cases, however, the wounds are usually of a superficial nature and exhibit more serious harm done to the clothing than to the person. On the introduction of accident insurance, a broad field was opened up to the speculative insurance swindler, and he has not been slow to avail himself of it. At first, the indemnity extended only to a given sum per week in the event of wholly disabling accidental injuries. More recently, the insurance companies have widened the range of benefits so as to pay 1/2, 1/3, or some other proportionate part of the principal sum insured under the policy in the event of loss by accident of a hand or a foot or the sight of an eye. By effecting insurance in several different companies so as to cover but a short period of time, especially by the purchase of accident tickets, a large aggregate amount can be obtained at a trivial cost. To a person who has never had his attention directed to this subject, it doubtless would be an almost overwhelming surprise were he to examine for himself the records and files of the claims department of accident insurance companies and learn for the first time the extent of the impostures therein noted and the ingenuity displayed in attempting to bring them to a successful issue. Often with, and sometimes without the assistance of an action at law, an occasional swindle is, in part at least, successfully accomplished. But as a general rule, its true character is exposed, and the chief actors not infrequently come to grief. We propose giving a few illustrative cases, and will let the first introduce himself by copying his notice of injury as written to the company in which he carried $10,000 accident insurance. Chicago, July 10, 1893. Mr. Rodney Dennis, Secretary. Dear Sir, on the evening of July 4th last, while in my room alone, I started to load my revolver preparatory to celebrating the day by shooting, as my roommates and friends were doing. While so engaged, I dropped it accidentally and it was discharged, the ball entering my left hand and literally tearing it to pieces, breaking 3 fingers also. I will not be able to resume the discharge of my duties for 30 days yet. I do solemnly swear this, the above, to be a true statement of facts. Let me hear from you soon, won't you, please? Yours truly. On receipt of this letter, the usual blank forms were sent to him, upon which to present his claim. He wrote again as follows. Chicago, July 16, 1893. Honorable Rodney Dennis, Secretary. Dear Sir, please permit me to acknowledge receipt of your indemnity blanks. As I do not know yet how long it will be before I can return to work, will it not be a good idea to wait until then before sending in my claim, or shall I fill it out now and send to you? Another thing I wish to ask. My expenses here for living are about $100 per month, and as my physician informs me that it will be at least 4 or 5 and possibly 6 weeks before I can begin to use my hands, I would much prefer going home. It is cheaper, and besides, I can see my folks. Now then, if I do that, what steps must I take toward collecting my indemnity? I am, with the greatest respect, yours truly. The insurance company sent these letters to its Chicago agency, and this led to a full investigation of the case. The injury was apparent, and its severity was substantially as alleged. It was ascertained that Hicks was insured in several companies, and that one company had settled with him. In effecting that settlement, it was learned that he had made statements as to the manner in which the alleged accident happened, which were materially different from what appeared in his letters to Secretary Dennis. A sharp cross-examination of the claimant followed, which resulted in his utter confusion. He tried to cover his falsehoods by repeating other and more flagrant ones, until he was completely overwhelmed with the hopelessness of the situation, and in his demoralization he admitted that the whole affair was not accidental at all, but was a scheme deliberately planned and carried out for the purpose of defrauding the insurance companies. Later on, upon more fully realizing the seriousness of the situation in which he was involved, he sought to make amends by writing out a frank confession, giving details and particulars, from which we make the following extracts. 2. The Travelers Insurance Company. The idea of working the insurance companies was developed in my mind last winter. My plan then was merely self-destruction. But as the scheme grew, and as I came to see by a careful study of them what the policies covered, I recognized a chance to make what I'd been looking for, namely, big money for myself by losing a hand accidentally. And so I increased my line of insurance accordingly to $20,000. And had I been successful, I would have collected $7,500 for the loss of my left hand. I was perfectly satisfied to part with it for that price, and I was disgusted when I found that the shot I'd put through my hand had not hopelessly crushed it, and I did all I could to induce the surgeon who attended me to amputate it anyway. Now please do not imagine me a fool, or insane, or a man who has acted hastily, for I have an active brain, a perfectly sound mind, and I gave many serious hours to the perfection of my scheme. At the time of this occurrence, Mr. H. was about 22 years of age, of genteel appearance, good address, a ready writer, fairly well educated, and occupied a responsible official position at the International Exposition then being held in Chicago. It is seldom that a person guilty of a crime of this nature will come forward and make a clean breast of it, as was done in this instance, even though confronted with indisputable evidence against him. At the most, there can be obtained only a tacit admission or a feeble denial of guilt. As a rule, the final consideration of each case depends on its circumstantial evidence, and by that alone it must be weighed in most of the illustrative cases we present in this chapter. Only a brief outline of these cases need be given, for it is our object at this time to disclose the nature of the injuries sustained and the manner in which they were inflicted, rather than to produce evidence going to show that they were intentional and not accidental. At the Lyons, New York agencies of 2 insurance companies, one BVD, purchased accident tickets to the total amount of $12,000 insurance to cover 24 hours from date at a cost of $1 premium. The tickets expired at 7:00 p.m. on January 3, 1890. At 6:50 p.m. of that day, his right foot and leg were crushed by the wheels of a passing freight train. The injured man said, "I was standing at the crossing in Lyons, waiting for a train to pass. About one half had gone by when my coat tail caught and threw me under the train. The injury necessitated amputation about 4 inches above the ankle joint. His insurance entitled him to 1/3 of the principal sum insured in the event of the accidental loss of 1 foot. Investigation showed that Dunham was but little known in that locality. He had no money and had borrowed $1 to pay his fare to Syracuse. He probably used the borrowed $1 to purchase the insurance tickets. The alleged accident occurred in the dark and when there was no eyewitness. He had been a cripple from childhood, the foot being paralyzed and often requiring the aid of crutches. It was generally believed that the injury was deliberately planned. He gladly accepted a small sum of money in lieu of that to which he would have been entitled had the claim been an honest one, and went on his way rejoicing. W.J.C. of Fulton, Kentucky, aged 31 years, sustained injuries of the left hand and wrist resulting in amputation at middle third of forearm. His account of alleged accident is as follows. In starting to board a railway train for Mayfield, Kentucky on the 21st day of September, 1892, at about 10:00 p.m., I caught my foot under a side-track rail and fell forward under the smoking car. In falling, I struck my head against side of car, rendering me unconscious for 20 or 30 seconds. When I regained consciousness, I began to push myself from under the coach and off the track. But before I could do so, my left hand was caught by trucks of coach 3 or 4 inches above the wrist and crushed so badly as to require amputation, which was done about 2 hours after the accident occurred. It was very dark at the time. No one saw him fall, but his cries were heard and prompt assistance reached him. He had recently taken out accident insurance to the amount of $16,000, some of it ticket insurance covering only 2 days. He was without means to pay ordinary living expenses and assigned his insurance tickets to his surgeons to secure payment for medical attendance. Orders of attachment by creditors were soon served on the several insurance companies to answer as garnishees, and there was a lively scramble to secure the payment of what had evidently been regarded by his creditors as worthless accounts. Compromise settlements were effected with his creditors, what little they thus obtained being regarded by them as so much clear gain. One A.J.C. of Hiawatha, Kansas, obtained $18,000 accident insurance in 2-day tickets written by 3 different companies. His story was, I was riding in a buggy carrying a gun. Team shied near a railroad bridge, and in my effort to prevent colliding with one of the posts in the bridge, the gun was discharged, the charge passing through left leg near ankle joint, which resulted in amputation of foot. An investigation followed, which satisfied all who had to do with it that the claim was not an honest one. W.S.F. of Cootersport, Pennsylvania, 40 years of age, invested $1 in the purchase of $6,000 accident insurance covering 2 days. While this insurance was in force, February 26, 1891, he took a shotgun and went out into the open fields. His statement was, I was going down a steep hill and slipped and fell down. In trying to save myself, the gun was discharged, and a charge of shot passed through my left hand, necessitating amputation at the wrist joint. There was no eyewitness. Report of investigation states that the place where this occurred was as good as one as could be selected if the person sought to avoid being seen. There were some boys 25 or 30 rods distant, but they were hidden from view by a growth of brush. The injured man was without means of support and hopelessly in debt. Numerous garnishee writs were at once served by creditors who hoped to benefit by the insurance. Investigation made it sufficiently clear that the shooting was intentional. F.C.M. of Hastings, Nebraska, age 42 years, obtained $26,000 accident insurance, it being placed in 5 different companies. At about 9:00 p.m., June 17, 1890, he sustained bodily injuries requiring amputation of his left hand. He relates the occurrence as follows. At the O&M Railroad crossing on Hastings Avenue, I tripped on the sidewalk, pitched forward, and in trying to save myself, my left arm was crushed by wheels of a train then passing. It was quite dark at the time, no eyewitnesses. His reason for taking so much accident insurance was that he was afraid of dogs biting him. Some of this insurance was for one day only, and of course was obtained at a trifling cost. The story of falling under the train, as alleged, was not credited by those who were familiar with the locality and all the circumstances surrounding the so-called accident. FDR of Indianapolis, Indiana, aged 19 years, told this story. I was in my room when a gun I was handling slipped out of my hand. In falling to the floor, the hammer must have struck against a piece of furniture with force enough to cock and let fall the hammer. The charge of shot entered my left hand, tearing it so badly as to require amputation above the wrist. He had first obtained accident insurance in 3 companies amounting to $16,000. He tried to obtain more in one of the companies, but the agent declined to write it. He then purchased at a gunsmith's a single-barrel shotgun, for which he paid $10. After he had shot his hand off, he sent the gun back with request to return him the $10, which was done. The case had all the earmarks of an intentional, self-inflicted injury and was so treated. R.P. of Wichita, Kansas, a plasterer, $20,500 accident insurance, says it happened to him in this manner. I was out hunting and had sat down to rest, and as I arose, my legs were somewhat cramped, and as there was some ice and snow on the ground, I fell, and in my fall the gun went off. My hand was so badly shattered it had to be taken off at once just above the wrist. Another person had been out with him, but at the time of the shooting was on the opposite side of the hedge, so there was no observer of the alleged accident, but he was conveniently near at hand to render assistance in the emergency. On investigation, it was regarded as a cleverly planned self-shooting affair. End of section 91. Section 92 of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Insurance Companies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Hampton. Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies, an authentic record of remarkable cases, by John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh. Section 92, Self-Mutilation and Accident Insurance, Part 2. W.H.H. of Everett, Nebraska, age 33 years, $12,000 accident insurance. His statement is, I was out hunting December 19, 1894, and was tripped by a stick getting between my legs, causing me to fall when my gun discharged, shooting my left hand so that it was amputated at the wrist. On investigation, it was ascertained that this man was a general good-for-nothing, shiftless, and never worked steadily. He had obtained $45 weekly indemnity on an accident ticket in May previous, and his claim at that time was looked upon with suspicion by the insurance company. At the time of purchasing one of the insurance tickets, just before shooting off his hand, he told the agent he was going to Mexico for his health. Accident insurance amounting to $25,000, distributed among 5 different companies, was taken out by J.B. of Springfield, Massachusetts, and not long afterwards he sustained seriously bodily injuries which, he states under oath, were caused in the following manner. On the morning of February 18, 1895, between the hours of 2 and 2:30 a.m., I received injuries which resulted in the loss of my right hand and wrist and left foot and ankle. I went to the railroad station in Springfield for the purpose of taking the train which leaves at 2:20 a.m. via the NY, NH, and H Railroad. I was going to South Norwalk, Connecticut on business. I entered the day coach and took my seat. I found the air of the coach somewhat close, and arose from my seat and passed out of the rear of the car for the purpose of getting a seat in one of the sleepers which were in the rear. While passing from the platform of the day coach to the platform of the sleeper, I either slipped or stumbled, which I cannot tell, and was thrown or fell from the platform to the ground. I think from the platform of the sleeper. Both gates on the platform of the car from which I fell or was thrown being open. In some way, but just in what way I cannot tell, I was drawn under the trucks of the sleeper. The wheels of one or both sleepers passed over and crushed my right hand and left foot. At the time I fell or was thrown from the platform, the train was moving slowly. The injuries which I received were so severe that it was necessary to amputate both my hand and foot, the hand being amputated a few inches above the wrist and the foot a few inches above the ankle joint. Under the policies he held, he was entitled to the full principal sum insured, $25,000, if the facts were as set forth in his affidavit, and also entitled to such damages as he might be able to recover from the railway company. A very careful investigation of this case was made. It was ascertained that the train in question was the regular night express from Boston to New York, and that it reached Springfield that night on time. It consisted of a baggage car, smoking car, ordinary passenger car, and 2 sleeping cars. The tracks run nearly east and west in front of the Springfield passenger station, which station is on the south side. At that point, the track is perfectly straight, in as perfect condition in every respect as it is possible for a track to be laid. And there can be no jolt or jar of a train in moving over those rails, which could be attributed to any defect or faulty construction of the roadbed. That particular train has been running for a long while, and it customarily stops in pretty nearly the same spot on arrival in Springfield. The extreme variation found after repeated observations did not exceed 20 feet, and the average was less than half of that distance. If the train stopped on the night in question, according to its usual custom, the forward truck of the first sleeper stood just where the injured man was found lying after the train had passed. He says that he left the coach in which he had been sitting and walked out the rear door to enter the sleeper. The train was then on its way to New York. Presumably, it moved faster than he walked, and with every step he took, the train was taking him further away from the station. By the time he could have reached the car platforms and have fallen under the trucks, he would have been many feet distant from the place where he was found. At that time of night, there are few or no passengers either to leave or enter the train at Springfield. The car platforms are provided with gates. On arrival at Springfield, the gates on the south side of train were opened by the brakeman, while those on the north side were left closed. The train hands change at that station. Before starting the train from the station, the conductor, who was on the south side of the train, saw that there were no passengers to enter, and then gave the usual call and signal to start. The brakemen boarded the train at their respective platforms and closed the gates after them. After it had started, the train proceeded on its way with no knowledge of what happened to Mr. B. Immediately after the train had passed, the injured man was seen lying upon the north side of the track. Excepting at the points where his limbs were crushed, his clothing was not disturbed or soiled. He had not been dragged by the train at all. It was next to impossible for a man to lie down, either voluntarily or unintentionally, so that the car wheel shall pass over his right wrist and left ankle. But it is easy enough to see that when the left foot has been placed, voluntarily or otherwise, so that a car wheel will crush it, the right hand may instinctively and involuntarily be thrust out and caught when the critical moment arrived to crush the foot. The injured man made a good recovery. He was found to be almost hopelessly bankrupt, and his creditors were eager for the insurance money. A portion of it he assigned, and trustee processes were served to cover much of it. One of the insurance companies that had not been served with a garnishee summons effected a settlement with the injured man by paying him about 2/5 of his claim. The creditors settled their assignments on payment of a trifle more than that. Whether the facts were as set forth by the insured or not, it was a terrible loss to him, and it is well that human nature is such that it will extend to him the deepest commiseration and pity, without stopping to inquire too closely into causes and motives. S.M.S. of Fairview, Pennsylvania, is a nailer by trade, but on account of work being slack, he had lately been engaged in knitting stockings on a small scale and peddling them through the country. This man obtained $26,000 accident insurance, and on the 16th of September, 1890, at near midnight, he sustained injuries which he said were caused as follows. I was approaching, and was near to the end of the main platform to take the train when I was caught by the train striking my basket and knocking me down. The cars crushed my right foot. I had basket on one arm and book satchel on the other arm, had been peddling stockings and selling books. My right leg was crushed and afterward amputated. There was no eyewitness to the alleged accident. Investigation satisfied all parties interested in making it that the claim for indemnity under his insurance policies was not an honest one, but for the purpose of effecting a settlement, a small percentage of the amount claimed was paid to him by the several companies. $25,000 accident insurance in 5 different companies was written upon JWW of York, Nebraska, and a few days later he went out hunting for game. His success is stated by himself as follows. I had shot a quail and was running and dropped the gun, being anxious to bag the quail. Gun was discharged by coming in contact with the ground, as I received the shot instantaneously with the dropping of the gun. The discharge passed through my ankle. His foot was amputated 4 inches above ankle. This little town in Nebraska had quite an epidemic of this class of accidents at about this time. W.T., a milkman in Detroit, on the 27th of September, 1888, received an injury caused by the accidental discharge of a gun. Amputation above the wrist followed. He was insured in 4 companies. Investigation disclosed that he was running a small milk business, peddling milk, and that he was financially embarrassed. The amount which he expects to realize for the loss of a hand will be quite a fortune to him. J.S. of Washington, Indiana, aged 24 years, purchased a one-day accident ticket March 8, 1888, and at about 11 o'clock at night he went down to the railway and was hurt, as he says, by some substance projecting 4 or 5 feet from the side of a passing freight car in a freight train, which projecting substance struck and threw me down, and my left hand fell on the rail, and the wheels of the car ran over it, and it had to be amputated. No one witnessed the occurrence, but the injured man was found lying down on the ground immediately afterward. So far as could be learned on careful inquiry, there was no unusual projecting substance on the train as alleged. E.J.S. was in London, Ontario, September 21, 1891, and late in the evening of that date he suffered a fearful mangling of both hands, which resulted in the amputation of the right hand above the wrist and of the middle and 4th fingers of the left hand. His story of how it happened is as follows. I was walking down a street near the railway. There was a train moving from the depot in the same direction as I was going. Part of the train had passed me when I heard footsteps behind me. I was immediately seized by some unknown person who passed his arm around my neck, garroted me, robbed me, and threw me under the passing train. I think I pushed myself back off the rails, and while my hands were still on the rails, the wheels of the train passed over them. I remember springing up and running, and I was sitting by the fence when parties came to me, I having called and shouted for help. A few days prior to this, he obtained insurance in 5 companies, amounting to over $20,000, some of it being short-term ticket insurance. Before the insurance companies had taken any steps toward an investigation, the story of assault and robbery, as alleged, was generally discredited. As a portion of the train had already passed before the assault was made, it was found to be an impossibility for so much to be accomplished before the remainder of the train could have wholly passed him. The train was not a lengthy one, and although running at a moderate rate of speed at the time, it was moving altogether too lively for him to have been thrown under it and escape with his life. It was learned that his hands had been for some time seriously impaired by disease. The claim which was presented under his insurance policies was at first disallowed on the ground of fraud through deliberate self-mutilation, but finally a compromise settlement was effected by paying little, if any, more than the cost of defending an action at law. W.T.S. of Toronto, Ontario, a commercial traveler, sustained loss of left hand on the evening of May 3, 1895. His statement is, I went to the Union Station for the purpose of mailing a letter. The letter box for mailing letters on train is on the door or side of post office car. The train was about starting, and I was stepping forward to put the letter in the box when I tripped over an obstruction and fell with my left arm across the rail. The wheel of the car passed over it. The postal car was not in the station, but was out in the yard where no passenger had occasion or business to go. It was 9 o'clock at night, and of course there were no immediate eyewitnesses in that locality to see just how it happened. The injured man was heavily overinsured, having taken out policies in 8 accident insurance companies. Only circumstantial evidence could be obtained to discredit the claim, and a compromise settlement was effected in variable sums by the several companies. In all of the preceding cases, it will be observed that the bodily injury sustained has resulted in loss of hand or foot, and it becomes an interesting study to consider what relation this particular class of injuries bears to accident insurance. In this chapter, we have dealt only with cases wherein there was more or less reason to suppose that the injuries were intentionally self-inflicted, and therefore at this time we may narrow down the inquiry to a consideration from that standpoint of the group of injuries so classified. The enlargement of the benefits under accident policies in the manner indicated was not generally adopted by insurance companies until during the year 1887. It was first made a feature of annual policies only, but on examination of the loss experience under accident tickets, it was found that accidental bodily injuries, resulting in amputation of an entire hand or foot, had occurred in ticket holders so seldom that it probably affected the total monetary loss to the companies very inconsiderably, if at all. It was then decided by one company at least to incorporate the same features in its insurance tickets. Less than 4 years was sufficient time to convince the company that the practice was not only disastrous to accident underwriting, but against public policy. In view of such results, it was eliminated from the tickets and has since been restricted to regular policies. In these 4 years, it was found that the company referred to was called upon to pay 1/3 of the principal sum insured under 33 insurance tickets for the loss of a left hand by each one so insured. For the loss of right hands, there were only 4 insurance tickets that had become claims during the same period of time. This is significant when we find that the tickets gave the insured as much indemnity for loss of his left as for his right hand. That there is greater liability to loss of left rather than of right hands in the general run of accidents has been clearly disproved by experience in writing practically the same kind of insurance, but for small amounts, upon large numbers of working men, including thousands of railway employees. This experience covered not only the same 4 years' time as did that of the ticket insurance, but also the subsequent 4 years, and is still going on. This insurance is general and extends to accidents of occupation and to those of everyday life and activity as well. During 8 years, it was found that 39 had sustained loss of left hand and 50 loss of right hand, the latter being largely in excess. Since the loss of limb feature has been abolished in the insurance tickets, it has been found that the amputation of hands and feet as the result of accidents to the holders of such tickets is of as rare occurrence as it was before such special insurance was written. These significant facts cannot be satisfactorily explained away, and they confirm the impression that there is no great moral hazard in writing short-term ticket insurance of the character indicated. End of section 92. End of Stratagems and Conspiracies to Defraud Life Insurance Companies, an authentic record of remarkable cases by John B. Lewis and Charles C. Bombaugh.